Welcome, keeper of Gotham's darkest secrets, to a journey through the shadowed halls of madness itself, where the thin line between sanity and chaos dissolves like mist before the dawn. Tonight, we shall walk alongside the Dark Knight through his most harrowing trial within the crumbling walls of Arkham Asylum, that infamous sanctuary where the city's most twisted souls find their temporary refuge. Let the steady rhythm of your heartbeat and the whisper of turning pages carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore the complete chronicles of one endless night, when heroism was tested against the very foundations of human darkness, and hope flickered like a candle flame in the depths of despair. In the beginning, before the night descended into chaos, and the carefully constructed order of Arkham Asylum crumbled beneath the weight of orchestrated madness, there existed what appeared to be routine, the kind of methodical procedure that had played out countless times before in the ongoing war between justice and insanity that defined Gotham City's never-ending struggle. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, forces were already in motion that would transform what should have been a simple prisoner transfer into a nightmare that would test every aspect of Batman's character, capability, and unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent, even when they seemed beyond salvation. The Batmobile's engines hummed with quiet efficiency as it approached the imposing gates of Arkham Asylum, carrying within its armored confines the most dangerous criminal mind that Gotham had ever produced. Though few who observed this seemingly routine delivery could have anticipated that they were witnessing the opening movement of a symphony of destruction that had been orchestrated with the meticulous precision of a master conductor, preparing his greatest and most terrible performance. The vehicle itself was a marvel of technological achievement, its sleek black form cutting through the evening mist like a predator stalking through familiar hunting grounds. Yet for all its impressive capabilities, it was merely transportation for the true weapon that Gotham's criminals feared most: the indomitable will of the man who had chosen to wage war against chaos itself. Within the passenger compartment, secured with restraints that had been specifically designed to contain individuals whose strength and cunning far exceeded normal human limitations, sat the Joker, his pale face split by that characteristic grin that had haunted the nightmares of countless victims and law enforcement officers throughout his long and bloody career. His appearance was deceptive in its apparent vulnerability, for here was a man whose true power lay not in physical strength, but in his absolute understanding of human psychology and his complete willingness to exploit every weakness, every fear, every trace of doubt that might provide him with the leverage necessary to accomplish his goals. The restraints that bound him were more than mere physical constraints. They represented society's desperate attempt to contain something that defied easy categorization or conventional understanding. The Joker was not simply a criminal in the traditional sense, but rather a force of nature, a living embodiment of chaos that seemed to exist for no purpose other than to demonstrate the fragility of the ordered world that most people took for granted. His crimes were not motivated by greed, revenge, or even conventional madness, but by a philosophical commitment to proving that civilization itself was nothing more than a thin veneer covering the abyss of meaninglessness that he believed lay at the heart of human existence. The asylum that awaited his return loomed against the storm clouds like a Gothic cathedral dedicated to the worship of human suffering, its towers and battlements silhouetted against the night sky in configurations that seemed designed to inspire dread rather than hope. Arkham Asylum had been constructed in an earlier era, when the treatment of mental illness was guided more by fear and superstition than by scientific understanding, and its architecture reflected the prevailing attitudes of its time toward those whose minds operated according to different principles than the majority of humanity considered normal or acceptable. The facility had undergone numerous renovations and expansions over the decades, each addition reflecting changing approaches to the treatment of criminal insanity, while also responding to the unique challenges posed by Gotham's unusually high concentration of individuals whose criminal activities transcended ordinary law-breaking to enter realms that bordered on the supernatural. The original mansion, built by the Arkham family in the 19th century, formed the historical core of the complex, its Gothic revival architecture serving as a constant reminder of the institution's origins in an age when madness was viewed as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. Subsequent additions had transformed the estate into a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings, each serving specific functions within the larger mission of containing and theoretically treating the most dangerous criminal minds that the justice system had proven incapable of rehabilitating through conventional means. The maximum security wing housed those inmates whose crimes had been so heinous that even the possibility of eventual release had been deemed too dangerous to contemplate, while specialized units provided enhanced containment for individuals whose abilities or psychological profiles required unique approaches to prevent their escape or harm to staff members. The island location had been chosen with careful consideration of both security requirements and symbolic significance, for Arkham Asylum stood apart from the mainland not merely as a matter of practical isolation, but as a physical manifestation of society's decision to separate itself from those elements that it could not understand, control, or reform. The waters that surrounded the facility served as both barrier and metaphor, creating a boundary between the world of normal human experience and the realm of criminal madness that seemed to operate according to entirely different rules and motivations. As the Batmobile approached the main gate, the guards who monitored the facility's perimeter prepared to execute procedures that had been refined through years of experience with inmates whose escape attempts had tested every aspect of the asylum's security systems. These were not ordinary corrections officers, but specially trained personnel who understood that their responsibilities extended far beyond simple custodial duties to encompass the much more complex challenge of maintaining order among individuals who viewed conventional authority structures as obstacles to be overcome rather than legitimate sources of guidance and restraint. The transfer protocol that governed the delivery of high-security inmates like the Joker involved multiple layers of verification and precautionary measures, each designed to minimize the possibility of escape or the kind of security breaches that had plagued the facility's earlier history. Electronic systems monitored every aspect of the process while human operators maintained constant communication with external law enforcement agencies that could provide additional support if circumstances required intervention beyond the Asylum's internal capabilities. Batman's role in this seemingly routine procedure was both professional and deeply personal, for his relationship with the Joker transcended the normal boundaries between law enforcement and criminal activity to encompass a psychological dynamic that neither man could easily escape or fully understand. Their encounters over the years had established patterns of conflict and resolution that had become almost ritualistic in their repetition. Yet, each confrontation carried the potential for variations that could prove catastrophic if either participant failed to maintain the careful balance that had prevented their ongoing war from spilling over into true apocalyptic destruction. The Dark Knight's presence during the transfer was ostensibly a matter of security, ensuring that the transition from mobile containment to institutional custody proceeded without incident. Yet, his deeper motivation lay in his need to witness personally the conclusion of each case that he brought to its resolution. This was not mere professional thoroughness, but a psychological requirement born from his unwavering commitment to seeing justice served completely, and his understanding that even the most careful security arrangements could be compromised by enemies whose intelligence and determination matched or exceeded those of their captors. The evening mist that shrouded the asylum grounds seemed to respond to the approaching vehicle with subtle movements that suggested awareness and anticipation, as though the very atmosphere recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. The facility's exterior lighting cast long shadows that shifted and danced with the natural motion of trees and architectural features, creating an environment where perception itself became unreliable, and where the boundary between reality and imagination grew thin enough to allow darker possibilities to seep through like poison gas, infiltrating a sealed chamber. Within the Batmobile's passenger compartment, the Joker's demeanor remained unchanged despite the proximity of his destination, his characteristic grin neither widening nor diminishing as the vehicle passed through the outer security checkpoints and began its final approach to the main facility. His apparent calm was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his behavior, for it suggested either complete confidence in his ability to escape whatever containment measures awaited him, or absolute indifference to the consequences of capture and imprisonment. The restraint system that secured him incorporated technologies developed specifically for individuals whose physical capabilities exceeded normal human parameters. Yet, the Joker's true danger had never resided primarily in his strength or speed, but in his profound understanding of human psychology and his willingness to exploit the weaknesses that he perceived in others. No technological solution could adequately address the threat posed by someone whose primary weapons were ideas, suggestions, and the carefully calculated manipulation of fears and desires that most people preferred to keep hidden even from themselves. The guards who awaited the vehicle's arrival had been briefed extensively on the specific protocols that governed interactions with this particular inmate, yet their training manuals could not adequately prepare them for the reality of dealing with someone whose very presence seemed to contaminate the environment around him with possibilities for chaos and destruction. The Joker's reputation preceded him like a cloud of toxic gas, creating an atmosphere of tension and apprehension that affected even the most experienced personnel, despite their professional commitment to maintaining emotional distance from the individuals in their custody. As the Batmobile came to a complete stop within the facility's secure delivery area, automated systems began the process of verifying the identity of both the delivered prisoner and his escort, while scanning for any unauthorized materials or devices that might compromise institutional security. These procedures, while necessary, added an element of delay to the transfer process that provided additional opportunities for unforeseen complications to arise. Though none of the participants could have anticipated the true scope of the events that had already been set in motion through careful planning and strategic positioning of assets both within and outside the asylum's walls. The mechanized restraint gurney that emerged from the vehicle's passenger compartment represented the culmination of decades of experience with high-security prisoner transfers, incorporating features designed to prevent escape attempts, while also ensuring that the transport process did not violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The balance between security and humane treatment was always delicate when dealing with inmates whose crimes had pushed the boundaries of human comprehension, yet the legal and ethical requirements remained unchanged, regardless of the moral revulsion that their actions might inspire in those responsible for their custody. Batman's emergence from the driver's compartment marked the beginning of the formal transfer ceremony, his imposing presence serving both practical and symbolic functions within the carefully choreographed sequence of events that would culminate in the Joker's return to institutional custody. The Dark Knight's reputation among the asylum staff was complex, combining respect for his effectiveness in apprehending dangerous criminals with concern about his methods and the psychological toll that his ongoing war against crime appeared to be exacting upon his own mental state. The facility's interior architecture had been designed with multiple purposes in mind, serving simultaneously as a treatment environment for individuals suffering from various forms of mental illness, and as a maximum security prison for those whose conditions made them too dangerous to house in conventional correctional facilities. The result was an environment that combined therapeutic elements with security features in ways that often created uncomfortable juxtapositions between the humanitarian ideals that theoretically guided the institution's mission and the harsh realities that governed its daily operations. The processing area where the Joker would begin his return to institutional life reflected this fundamental tension in its combination of medical equipment and security hardware, creating an atmosphere that was neither fully clinical nor entirely carceral, but rather something new and disturbing that seemed to embody society's confusion about how to respond to forms of criminal behavior that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and moral responsibility. The staff members who worked in this environment had learned to compartmentalize their responses to the ethical dilemmas that their duties created, yet the strain of maintaining professional detachment while dealing with individuals who seemed to embody pure malevolence was evident in their careful movements and guarded expressions. As the transfer proceeded through its predetermined stages, the Joker maintained his characteristic demeanor of amused detachment, observing the security measures and institutional procedures with the air of a connoisseur evaluating a performance whose outcome he had already determined. His compliance with the processing requirements was absolute yet somehow mocking, as though his cooperation itself was a form of manipulation designed to lull his captors into a false sense of security, while he prepared to demonstrate the inadequacy of their containment systems. The journey deeper into the facility's interior revealed the full scope of Arkham Asylum's transformation from its origins as a private estate into a specialized institution for the criminally insane, with each corridor and chamber reflecting different phases of expansion and renovation that had been necessitated by the ever-increasing sophistication of Gotham's criminal element. The walls themselves seemed to contain memories of the violence and suffering that had occurred within their confines, creating an atmosphere of accumulated malevolence that affected even casual visitors with its oppressive weight. The other inmates whose cells lined the corridors through which the procession passed represented a catalogue of human psychological dysfunction that ranged from the pitiable to the terrifying, each case study in the failure of conventional society to address the root causes of criminal behavior before they metastasized into something beyond redemption or rehabilitation. Their reactions to the Joker's passage varied from fearful withdrawal to excited agitation, suggesting that even among the criminally insane, his reputation as an agent of chaos commanded a unique form of respect or terror. The elevator that would carry the group to the high-security wing where the Joker's cell awaited represented both a technological marvel and a symbolic transition between the public areas of the facility where some pretense of therapeutic purpose could be maintained, and the deeper levels where the institution's true function as a warehouse for irredeemable monsters became impossible to disguise or rationalize. The mechanical systems that operated the elevator had been reinforced and redesigned multiple times to prevent their use as escape routes, yet their very existence created vulnerabilities that determined enemies might exploit given sufficient preparation and opportunity. As the elevator began its descent into the bowels of the asylum, the fluorescent lighting that had illuminated the upper levels gave way to harsher, more utilitarian illumination that cast sharp shadows and created pools of darkness where the imagination could populate the unseen spaces. with threats both real and imagined. The transition was gradual but unmistakable, marking the passage from areas where hope might still exist to regions where despair had taken permanent residence, and where the very air seemed contaminated with the exhalations of broken minds and corrupted souls. The security personnel who accompanied the group maintained their professional alertness despite the apparent routine nature of the procedure, their training having taught them that complacency was the greatest enemy of institutional safety, and that even the most carefully planned operations could be compromised by unexpected variables or by the simple human tendency to let attention wander when circumstances appeared stable. Their weapons remained readily accessible, while their communications equipment maintained constant contact with the facility's central command center, where additional resources could be summoned at the first indication of trouble. Batman's presence during this phase of the transfer served purposes beyond mere security escort, for his intimate knowledge of the Joker's psychology and methods made him uniquely qualified to detect signs of preparation for escape attempts or other forms of disruptive behavior that might not be apparent to personnel whose experience was limited to institutional settings. The complex relationship between these two individuals had evolved over years of conflict into something approaching mutual understanding, though neither would have characterized their connection in terms that suggested anything resembling sympathy or affection. The moment when the elevator's power failed and emergency lighting activated marked the first indication that the evening's events would deviate from their planned trajectory. Though the immediate response of both Batman and the security team suggested that such contingencies had been anticipated and prepared for through extensive training and contingency planning, the darkness that enveloped the small space created opportunities for psychological manipulation that someone with the Joker's expertise might exploit, yet the physical restraints that secured him appeared adequate to prevent any immediate threat to the safety of the other occupants. Batman's instantaneous movement to secure the Joker more completely demonstrated both his understanding of the criminal's capabilities and his refusal to allow even momentary vulnerabilities to remain unexploited. Yet the Joker's reaction to this additional restraint suggested amusement rather than frustration, as though the Dark Knight's precautions were exactly what he had expected and possibly what he had hoped to provoke. The brief physical contact between them carried undertones of their long history of conflict while also establishing the parameters within which the evening's events would unfold. The restoration of power and the elevator's resumed operation provided temporary relief from the tension that the mechanical failure had created, yet the incident served as a reminder that even the most sophisticated security systems remained vulnerable to both accidental malfunction and deliberate sabotage. The facility's backup systems had functioned as designed, yet the brief interruption of normal operations had created a psychological atmosphere of uncertainty that would persist throughout the remainder of the transfer process and beyond. As the elevator reached its destination and the doors opened to reveal the high security wing where the Joker would resume his residence, the assembled personnel prepared to execute the final phase of the transfer protocol with the heightened awareness that their earlier confidence in routine procedures had been shaken by the reminder that nothing involving this particular inmate could ever be considered truly routine or predictable. The corridor that stretched before them represented the culmination of their journey, yet also marked the beginning of whatever events the Joker had set in motion through preparations that remained hidden from their understanding. In the aftermath of the Joker's calculated escape from what should have been impenetrable restraints, Batman found himself thrust into an environment that had been transformed from a secure medical facility into a hunting ground where the traditional roles of predator and prey had been deliberately obscured through the machinations of a criminal mind that understood better than most how to weaponize chaos against the forces of order. The corridors that had moments before represented the ordered progression of institutional routine, now stretched before him like arteries in a diseased organism, their familiar architecture suddenly alien and threatening, as emergency lighting cast shadows that seemed to move with purpose and malevolent intent. The silence that followed the Joker's departure was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of anticipation, a pregnant pause in which the very air seemed to hold its breath while waiting for the violence that everyone present understood was inevitable. The guards who had been tasked with ensuring the smooth completion of the transfer process now found themselves transformed into potential victims, their training and experience suddenly inadequate preparation for confronting an enemy who operated according to principles that conventional law enforcement procedures had never been designed to address. Batman's immediate response to the crisis demonstrated the psychological preparation that separated him from ordinary crime fighters, for his transition from escort to active combatant occurred without the hesitation or disorientation that might have afflicted someone less familiar with the Joker's methods and capabilities. The Dark Knight had spent years studying his adversary's patterns of behavior, developing countermeasures and contingency plans for scenarios that most people would have dismissed as too extreme to warrant serious consideration. Yet even his extensive preparation could not have anticipated every variable that the evening's events would introduce. The first indication that the asylum's security had been compromised on a scale far exceeding the simple escape of a single prisoner came with the discovery that communications systems throughout the facility had been systematically disrupted, creating islands of isolation where staff members found themselves cut off from both their colleagues and the outside world that might have provided assistance. This was not the work of opportunistic criminals taking advantage of unexpected circumstances, but rather the implementation of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been developed over months, or possibly years, of patient observation and méticuleux préparation. The emergence of Victor Zizas from what should have been secure containment revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had transformed Batman's routine prisoner delivery into the opening move of a campaign designed to demonstrate the futility of society's attempts to impose order upon the fundamental chaos that the Joker believed lay at the heart of human existence. Zizas himself was perhaps the most disturbing member of Batman's rogues gallery, not because his crimes exceeded those of others in their scope or violence, but because they reflected a philosophy of nihilism so complete and systematic that it challenged basic assumptions about the value of human life. The serial killer's appearance had been altered by his years of incarceration, yet the changes went beyond simple physical deterioration to encompass a spiritual corruption that seemed to radiate from his presence like heat from a furnace. The tallies that covered his body represented not merely a record of his crimes, but a philosophical statement about the meaninglessness of individual existence. Each mark a deliberate rejection of the idea that consciousness possessed inherent value or dignity worth preserving against the forces of entropy and dissolution. His selection of a guard as his hostage demonstrated the calculated precision with which the evening's events had been planned. For the victim was not chosen randomly, but represented someone whose death would serve specific purposes within the larger design that the Joker had conceived. The psychological impact upon Batman of witnessing an innocent person threatened by someone whose crimes he had previously failed to prevent completely added layers of personal motivation to what might otherwise have been simply professional obligation to restore order and protect public safety. The hostage situation that unfolded in the asylum's communication center revealed both the sophistication of the escape plan and the psychological insight that had guided its development. For the perpetrators understood that Batman's greatest weakness lay not in any physical vulnerability, but in his absolute commitment to preserving innocent life, even at the cost of tactical advantage. The positioning of the victim and the specific demands that accompanied the confrontation were designed to force the Dark Knight into situations where his moral principles would conflict with practical necessities, creating psychological pressure that might lead to mistakes or hesitation at crucial moments. The facility's security systems had been compromised in ways that suggested inside knowledge of their operation and vulnerabilities, indicating that the conspiracy extended beyond the escaped inmates to encompass individuals who had access to classified information about the asylum's defensive measures and emergency protocols. This revelation transformed the situation from a containment problem into a counterintelligence operation, where distinguishing allies from enemies required constant vigilance and suspicious evaluation of every piece of information and every offer of assistance. Batman's response to the immediate threat posed by Zsas demonstrated the tactical thinking that had enabled him to survive years of confrontation with enemies whose capabilities exceeded those of ordinary criminals. Yet the solution he employed also revealed the moral framework that guided his actions even under extreme pressure. The glide kick that neutralized the serial killer was precisely calculated to minimize risk to the hostage while ensuring that the threat was eliminated completely, reflecting the kind of split-second decision-making that required both exceptional physical capability and absolute confidence in one's moral compass. The technology that enabled Batman's intervention represented years of development and refinement, incorporating advances in materials, science, and engineering that transformed theoretical possibilities into practical tools for combating crime in environments where conventional law enforcement methods proved inadequate. The gliding capability that his modified cape provided was not merely a means of transportation, but a tactical advantage that allowed him to approach enemies from unexpected angles while avoiding the ground-based obstacles and defensive measures that they might have prepared. The psychological profile that emerged from observation of Zsas during the confrontation revealed the systematic methodology that characterized his approach to murder and the philosophical framework that he used to justify actions that most people would find incomprehensible in their casual cruelty and apparent meaninglessness. His calm demeanor in the face of capture suggested either complete confidence in his ultimate escape or genuine indifference to the consequences of his actions, both possibilities equally disturbing in their implications for understanding the nature of criminal psychology. The rescue of the guard who had served as Zsas's hostage provided Batman with crucial intelligence about the scope and organization of the conspiracy that had transformed the asylum from a secure facility into a battleground where the forces of order confronted chaos in its most concentrated and malevolent form. The victim's account of events leading up to his capture revealed coordination among the escaped inmates that exceeded what might have been expected from individuals whose mental conditions theoretically prevented them from engaging in complex cooperative planning. The communication equipment that Zsas had been attempting to disable represented a crucial link between the asylum and the outside world, its destruction forming part of a larger strategy designed to isolate the facility and prevent external intervention, while the escaped inmates pursued whatever objectives had motivated their carefully planned breakout. The technical sophistication required to interfere with these systems suggested access to specialized knowledge and equipment that ordinary criminals would not have possessed, indicating either outside assistance or the involvement of individuals whose expertise extended far beyond conventional criminal activity. Harley Quinn's voice, crackling through the facility's public address system, marked the next phase of the psychological warfare campaign that had been designed to maximize Batman's isolation while forcing him to confront multiple threats simultaneously across a geographic area too, large to monitor effectively from any single position. Her announcement that she had taken Warden Sharp hostage represented an escalation in the stakes that transformed the situation from a containment operation into a rescue mission where time constraints added pressure to decision-making processes that already operated under extreme stress. The warden's capture carried implications beyond the immediate threat to his personal safety, for his knowledge of the facility's security measures and emergency protocols could provide the escaped inmates with information that would enable them to neutralize defensive systems and gain access to areas that should have remained secure even in the event of a general breakout. The possibility that he might be coerced into revealing classified information added urgency to the rescue operation, while also creating strategic complications that could compromise future security. Even if the immediate crisis was resolved successfully, the route that Batman was forced to follow in pursuing his objectives led him deeper into the facility's interior architecture, through corridors and chambers that had been designed to contain the criminally insane, but now served as a maze, where danger might lurk behind every corner, and where the familiar had been transformed into the threatening through the simple expedient of removing the security measures that normally maintained order. The emergency lighting that had replaced normal illumination created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight where shadows provided concealment for potential attackers, while also generating psychological pressure through their suggestion of concealed threats. The ventilation system that provided Batman with alternative routes through the facility represented both opportunity and vulnerability, for while it allowed him to bypass areas where enemies might be waiting in ambush, it also created potential points of attack where gas or other weapons could be introduced to affect large areas simultaneously. The decision to utilize these passages required careful evaluation of risks and benefits, while maintaining awareness that the very infrastructure he was using for tactical advantage might have been compromised or modified by enemies who had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the Asylum's design and operation. The discovery of guards who had been suspended over tanks of Joker toxin revealed the sadistic creativity that characterized the Clown Prince of Crime's approach to psychological warfare, combining immediate physical threat with symbolic messaging, designed to demonstrate his power over life and death, while also forcing Batman to make rapid decisions about resource allocation and tactical priorities. The green liquid that bubbled beneath the victims represented not merely a weapon but a statement about the Joker's philosophy regarding the arbitrary nature of survival and the meaninglessness of conventional moral categories. The precision required to save all of the endangered guards simultaneously tested Batman's ability to coordinate multiple actions while operating under severe time constraints, demanding both exceptional physical skill and strategic thinking. Capable of identifying solutions that preserved every life at risk, without creating new vulnerabilities or opportunities for the enemy to exploit. The batarang that activated the ventilation fans demonstrated the utility of seemingly simple tools when employed with proper understanding of mechanical systems and environmental factors. The Joker's painted arrows that led deeper into the facility served multiple purposes within his psychological campaign, providing apparent guidance that was actually manipulation designed to channel Batman's movements according to predetermined patterns, while also serving as taunting reminders of the villain's control over the situation and his confidence in the ultimate success of whatever plan he was implementing. The bright green color of the directional indicators was chosen not merely for visibility, but for its association with the toxins and chemicals that had become the Joker's signature weapons. The trap that awaited Batman at the designated destination represented the culmination of careful preparation and psychological manipulation, combining physical threat with symbolic messaging in ways that demonstrated the Joker's understanding of his opponent's character and the pressure points that might be exploited to create maximum psychological impact. The mutated prisoner who served as the trap's primary component had been transformed from a human being into a weapon through the application of experimental chemicals that reflected the villain's willingness to treat other people as raw materials for his schemes. The Titan serum that had produced this transformation represented a perversion of legitimate medical research, taking discoveries that might have been used to treat genetic disorders or enhance human capability, and corrupting them into instruments for creating monsters that served no purpose beyond destruction and terror. The irony that cutting-edge science had been perverted into a tool for creating prehistoric brutality was not lost on either the perpetrator or his intended victim, serving as a commentary on the potential for knowledge to be corrupted when it fell into the wrong hands. The combat encounter that followed tested Batman's ability to adapt his techniques to opponents whose capabilities exceeded normal human parameters, while maintaining the moral constraints that prevented him from using lethal force, even against enemies who had been transformed beyond easy recognition as former human beings. The tactical challenge of defeating an opponent who possessed superior strength and apparent immunity to conventional attacks required creative application of available resources while operating under the additional pressure of knowing that failure would result in his own death and the continuation of whatever larger plan his defeat was meant to facilitate. The unexpected death of the mutated prisoner before the battle could reach its conclusion revealed either flaws in the enhancement process or deliberate limitations that had been built into the serum to prevent the created monsters from surviving long enough to pose threats to their creators. This possibility suggested that the Joker's plans extended beyond simple mayhem to encompass more sophisticated objectives that required careful control over the tools and weapons he employed in pursuing them. The revelation that Frank Bowles had been working as an inside accomplice in the conspiracy demonstrated the extent to which the escape plan had required months or years of preparation, involving the recruitment and coordination of assets both within the facility and outside its walls. Bowles' betrayal of his professional obligations and colleagues reflected either ideological commitment to the Joker's cause or coercion through threats or promises that overcame his loyalty to legitimate authority and his responsibility to protect the public safety. Commissioner Gordon's capture represented perhaps the most serious escalation in the stakes that the evening's events had produced, for his role as Batman's primary liaison with legitimate law enforcement made him both a valuable hostage and a symbol of the cooperation between official and unofficial crime-fighting efforts that had enabled Gotham's unique approach to maintaining public order. His knowledge of Batman's methods and identity created security implications that extended far beyond the immediate rescue operation to encompass the long-term viability of the Dark Knight's mission. The trail of alcohol that led Batman toward his next objective demonstrated the attention to detail that characterized the planning behind the escape, with even seemingly random elements like a corrupt guard's drinking problem being incorporated into the larger scheme as tools for manipulation and misdirection. The detective work required to identify and follow this trail showcased Batman's analytical capabilities, while also revealing how thoroughly his enemies had studied his methods and prepared countermeasures for the investigative techniques he might employ. The detective mode technology that enabled Batman to perceive and analyze trace evidence invisible to normal observation represented one of the most significant advantages he possessed over both criminals and conventional law enforcement, yet its very effectiveness created tactical vulnerabilities by encouraging dependence upon technological solutions to problems that might require more fundamental approaches. The ability to see through walls and identify chemical traces provided crucial intelligence, while also creating psychological distance from the immediate physical environment that surrounded him. The destruction of the elevator cables that followed Batman's investigation represented both tactical harassment designed to slow his progress and strategic positioning intended to channel his movements through routes that had been prepared with additional obstacles and ambush. Opportunities. The explosion that severed the mechanical systems demonstrated access to military-grade equipment and expertise in demolitions that suggested either outside assistance or the involvement of individuals whose criminal backgrounds included specialized technical knowledge. The climb through the elevator shaft that became necessary as a result of this sabotage provided opportunities for additional psychological pressure through the claustrophobic environment and the constant possibility of attack from above or below, while also demonstrating the physical conditioning and mental resilience that enabled Batman to continue pursuing his objectives despite the accumulating fatigue and stress that the evening's events had produced. The vertical ascent through darkened mechanical spaces served as a metaphor for the hero's determination to overcome obstacles through persistence and refusal to accept defeat regardless of the odds against success. The Riddler's challenges that began to appear throughout the facility represented another layer of psychological warfare designed to exploit Batman's compulsive need to solve puzzles and mysteries, even when doing so diverted time and attention from more pressing operational objectives. The placement of trophies and riddles throughout the asylum demonstrated planning that extended far beyond the immediate escape operation, to encompass a comprehensive assault on the Dark Knight's psychological equilibrium through multiple, simultaneous pressures and distractions. The intellectual satisfaction that came from solving these puzzles created internal conflict for Batman between his desire to complete every challenge and his recognition that time spent on optional activities might cost lives, or allow the base's primary conspiracy to achieve objectives that could have been prevented through more focused attention to tactical priorities. The temptation to pursue intellectual gratification in the midst of operational crisis reflected character traits that his enemies understood and were deliberately exploiting. The collectible items scattered throughout the environment served multiple purposes beyond simple distraction, providing intelligence about the facility's layout and history, while also revealing the extent to which the escaped inmates had been able to move freely throughout areas that should have remained secure. The Joker's chattering teeth toys that appeared in various locations carried particular psychological significance as reminders of their owner's omnipresence and his confidence that his plans would succeed regardless of opposition. The maps that could be discovered through careful exploration provided tactical advantages by revealing the locations of additional challenges and secrets. Yet their very existence raised questions about how they had been placed and who had possessed the access necessary to distribute them throughout the facility. The possibility that Asylum staff members had been compromised or coerced into cooperation extended the paranoia that was becoming an increasingly significant factor in Batman's decision-making processes. The open-world structure that became apparent as Batman gained access to larger areas of the facility reflected the careful balance between providing freedom of movement and maintaining narrative focus, creating an environment where exploration could be rewarded without completely derailing the primary mission objectives. The interconnected areas that comprised the asylum's geography had been designed with multiple routes and hidden passages that rewarded thorough investigation, while also providing tactical options for approaching objectives from unexpected directions. The atmosphere of decay and neglect that permeated many areas of the facility reflected both the inadequate funding that had characterized Arkham's operations for years and the deliberate sabotage that had been conducted in preparation for the evening's events. The Gothic architecture that formed the foundation of the complex created an environment where shadows and architectural details could conceal threats, while also generating psychological pressure through their associations with death, madness, and spiritual corruption. The transformation of familiar institutional spaces into threatening environments demonstrated the power of context and lighting to alter perception and emotional response, turning corridors that might appear mundane under normal circumstances into passages that seemed to invite ambush and violence. The emergency lighting that had replaced normal illumination contributed to this effect by creating harsh contrasts and deep shadows that made accurate assessment of distances and spatial relationships more difficult, while also generating a constant sense of impending danger. As Batman progressed deeper into the facility's interior, the evidence of planning and preparation that had preceded the escape became increasingly apparent, revealing a conspiracy that had required extensive resources, detailed knowledge of the asylum's operations, and coordination among individuals whose mental conditions theoretically made such cooperation unlikely, if not impossible. The implications of this discovery extended beyond the immediate crisis to raise fundamental questions about the nature of criminal insanity and the assumptions that guided society's approach to containing and treating individuals who posed ongoing threats to public safety. The emergence from the asylum's claustrophobic interior into the storm-swept expanse of the island's exterior marked a profound transformation in the nature of Batman's mission, expanding what had begun as a contained institutional crisis into something approaching warfare across terrain that had been carefully prepared to serve as a battlefield where conventional advantages of training and technology might be neutralized by environmental factors and the sheer scope of the operational area. The night air that greeted him carried with it the mingled sense of salt spray from the surrounding waters and chemical corruption from whatever modifications had been made to the facility's infrastructure, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizable as the Gotham he had sworn to protect, yet transformed by malevolent intention into something that challenged his understanding of the city's geography and character. The island that stretched before him had been revealed in its true scope for the first time since his arrival, no longer constrained by the architectural boundaries that had defined his earlier movements, but expanded to encompass a landscape that combined natural features with institutional development in ways that created countless opportunities for ambush, concealment, and tactical misdirection. The original Arkham estate had been constructed on elevated ground that provided commanding views of the surrounding waters, while also offering defensive advantages to anyone seeking to control access to the facility's most sensitive areas. Yet these same geographical features could be exploited by enemies who understood how to use terrain as a weapon against conventional law enforcement approaches. The transformation of what had once been manicured gardens and carefully maintained grounds into a wild landscape that seemed to embody the psychological chaos of its inhabitants reflected years of neglect and deliberate sabotage that had allowed nature to reclaim areas that human intervention had once kept under strict control. The pathways that connected different sections of the complex had been designed to facilitate efficient movement between buildings, while also providing aesthetic pleasure through their integration with natural features. Yet the current state of these routes suggested that maintenance had been abandoned or actively disrupted to create obstacles and choke points where travelers might be delayed or channeled into predetermined killing zones. The Gothic architecture that dominated the facility's visual character extended beyond the main buildings to encompass smaller structures and decorative elements scattered throughout the grounds, creating a unified aesthetic that spoke to the 19th century sensibilities of the Asylum's original designers, while also serving practical functions within the institution's security infrastructure. The gargoyles and sculptural elements that adorned various buildings provided more than mere decoration, serving as observation points and tactical positions, from which defenders or attackers might monitor approaches and coordinate responses to threats or opportunities. The weather systems that swept across the island carried with them atmospheric disturbances that seemed to respond to the emotional and psychological tensions that had been building throughout the evening, creating environmental conditions that enhanced the dramatic impact of events, while also providing practical cover for movement and misdirection. The storm clouds that gathered overhead reflected the internal turmoil that characterized both the facility's inmates and the hero who sought to restore order to their chaotic world, while the lightning that periodically illuminated the landscape provided brief moments of clarity that revealed dangers and opportunities before plunging observers back into uncertainty and shadow. The lighting systems that had been installed to provide security illumination throughout the exterior areas had been systematically modified or destroyed, creating pools of darkness that could conceal movement, while also generating psychological pressure through their suggestion of hidden threats and unknown dangers. The remaining illumination came primarily from emergency systems and backup power sources that had been designed to function independently of the main electrical grid. Yet even these secondary systems showed signs of tampering that indicated the extensive preparation and technical expertise that had been invested in transforming the island into a trap designed specifically for Batman's capture or elimination. The discovery of the Batmobile in a state of violent assault revealed both the scope of the conspiracy that had been orchestrated against him and the symbolic significance that his enemies attached to the destruction of the technological tools that had enabled his crime-fighting effectiveness. The vehicle itself represented years of development and refinement, incorporating advances in materials, science, electronics, and weapon systems that made it one of the most sophisticated pieces of equipment available to any law enforcement agency. Yet its current condition demonstrated that even the most advanced technology could be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers of determined attackers operating with tactical coordination and strategic planning. The damage that had been inflicted upon the vehicle extended beyond simple vandalism to encompass systematic destruction of specific systems and components, suggesting that the attackers possessed detailed knowledge of its construction and capabilities that could only have been acquired through extensive surveillance and technical analysis. The targeting of communications equipment, defensive systems, and mobility mechanisms indicated a coordinated effort to eliminate Batman's ability to call for assistance or escape from the island if circumstances made retreat necessary, effectively isolating him from external support, while also removing tactical options that might have enabled him to operate more effectively against superior numbers. The explosive gel that Batman recovered from the wreckage of his vehicle represented one of the most versatile tools in his technological arsenal, capable of serving multiple functions from breaching obstacles to creating diversions and eliminating specific threats through precisely controlled applications of destructive force. The chemical composition that made this weapon effective had been developed through extensive research into materials, science, and explosive engineering, creating a substance that could be applied with surgical precision, while also generating sufficient force to overcome hardened defensive positions and structural barriers. The tactical applications for this recovered equipment extended far beyond immediate combat situations to encompass the broader strategic challenge of navigating an environment that had been systematically modified to prevent escape and blanked channel movement through predetermined routes where ambushes and traps could be most effectively employed. The ability to create new passages through walls and barriers would provide crucial flexibility in route planning, while also offering opportunities to surprise enemies who might have prepared defensive positions based on assumptions about available approaches and lines of attack. The Riddler's challenges that began appearing throughout the exterior areas demonstrated the extent to which the island's entire geography had been incorporated into the psychological warfare campaign designed to exploit Batman's compulsive need to solve puzzles and uncover hidden secrets, even when doing so diverted resources from more pressing operational objectives. The placement of trophies and riddles in locations that required significant effort to reach suggested extensive preparation time and detailed knowledge of the facility's layout, while the complexity of some challenges indicated intellectual capabilities that exceeded what might have been expected from someone whose criminal reputation was based primarily on elaborate but ultimately simple puzzles and wordplay. The integration of these intellectual challenges with the island's natural and architectural features created a comprehensive testing ground that evaluated not only problem-solving abilities, but also physical conditioning, technological resourcefulness, and psychological resilience under conditions of extreme stress and time pressure. The satisfaction that came from successfully completing these challenges created internal conflict between immediate gratification and long-term strategic thinking, forcing Batman to constantly evaluate whether the intelligence and equipment gained from optional activities justified the time and energy expenditure they required. The interconnected nature of the island's various areas reflected careful urban planning that had been designed to facilitate efficient movement between different functional zones while also maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the overall design concept. The pathways that connected the medical facility with the administrative areas, the prisoner housing with the recreational spaces, and the utility infrastructure with the security installations, created a network of routes that could be used for tactical advantage by anyone with sufficient understanding of the complex's geography and operational requirements. The elevation changes that characterized the island's topography provided natural defensive positions and observation points that could be exploited by either attackers or defenders, depending upon the specific tactical situation and the resources available to each side. The higher ground that surrounded the central facilities offered commanding views of approaches from the water, while also providing platforms from which weapons or surveillance equipment could be deployed to maximum effectiveness. Yet these same positions could become traps if attackers succeeded in surrounding them or cutting off escape routes. The vegetation that had been allowed to grow wild in many areas of the island provided both concealment opportunities and obstacles to movement, creating an environment where stealth approaches might be facilitated while also generating unpredictable variables that could affect the outcome of tactical engagements through their impact on visibility, mobility, and communications. The trees and undergrowth that had reclaimed former garden areas offered natural camouflage for anyone seeking to avoid detection, while also creating choke points and ambush sites where small numbers of defenders might successfully engage larger attacking forces. The utility infrastructure that supported the facility's operations had been modified and expanded over decades of institutional growth, creating a complex network of underground passages, service tunnels, and mechanical spaces that could provide alternative routes for movement, while also serving as potential points of vulnerability where critical systems might be sabotaged or infiltrated. The sewers, steam tunnels, and electrical conduits that connected different areas of the complex created a secondary geography beneath the visible landscape where different rules of engagement might apply and where conventional tactical advantages could be neutralized by environmental factors. The trail of tobacco that Batman was able to detect and follow using his enhanced analytical capabilities represented the kind of forensic evidence that had enabled his investigative success in countless previous cases. Yet the deliberate nature of its placement suggested either carelessness on the part of Commissioner Gordon's captors or calculated misdirection designed to channel his pursuit along predetermined routes where additional obstacles and threats might be waiting. The chemical signature that made tracking possible reflected both the Commissioner's long-time smoking habit and the atmospheric conditions that had preserved the trace evidence, despite exposure to wind and weather. The medical facility that had been identified as the location where Gordon was being held represented one of the most sensitive areas within the entire complex, containing both valuable equipment that could be used for legitimate treatment purposes and dangerous materials that could be weaponized by individuals with sufficient technical knowledge and complete disregard for human safety. The specialized nature of the medical equipment stored within this facility made it a natural target for anyone seeking to acquire tools that could be used to enhance human capabilities or create biological weapons that might serve terrorist objectives or personal vendettas. The approach routes that led to the medical facility had been designed with security considerations in mind, incorporating choke points and defensive positions that could be used to prevent unauthorized access, while also providing escape routes for personnel who might need to evacuate in emergency situations. The architectural features that served these security functions created tactical challenges for anyone attempting to infiltrate the facility, while also offering potential advantages to defenders who understood how to exploit the environmental characteristics for maximum effectiveness. The evidence of Harley Quinn's presence that Batman discovered through careful observation and analysis revealed the sophisticated planning that had preceded the evening's events, demonstrating coordination between different members of the criminal conspiracy that suggested either exceptional leadership capabilities or external direction from sources with experience in military or intelligence operations. The timing and placement of her actions indicated detailed knowledge of security procedures and personnel schedules that could only have been acquired through extensive surveillance or inside information provided by compromised staff members. The psychological profile that emerged from analysis of Harley Quinn's methods and objectives revealed a complex individual whose apparent instability masked sophisticated understanding of human psychology and tactical planning, making her perhaps more dangerous than enemies whose capabilities were more obviously threatening, but also more predictable in their application. Her relationship with the Joker provided motivation and direction for her actions, while also creating potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited by anyone who understood the psychological dynamics that bound them together in their shared commitment to chaos and destruction. The electric barrier that protected Harley Quinn's position within the medical facility represented advanced technology that had been either stolen from legitimate research institutions or developed independently by individuals with access to specialized knowledge and manufacturing capabilities. The energy requirements for maintaining such a defensive system suggested either connection to the facility's main power grid or portable generation equipment that would have required significant resources to acquire and install, indicating planning and preparation that extended far beyond the capabilities of individual criminals operating without institutional support. The tactical challenge presented by this defensive system required creative problem-solving that went beyond conventional approaches to breaching fortified positions, forcing Batman to identify alternative routes and methods that could overcome technological advantages through the application of superior knowledge, equipment, or strategic thinking. The time pressure created by the knowledge that innocent lives were at stake added urgency to this problem-solving process, while also creating opportunities for mistakes or oversights that could prove catastrophic if they allowed critical opportunities to be missed or tactical advantages to be surrendered. The doctors who had been taken hostage within the medical facility represented both immediate victims requiring rescue and potential sources of intelligence about the conspiracy's objectives and methods. Yet their psychological state following exposure to the trauma and stress of captivity made them unreliable sources of information whose accounts might be colored by fear, confusion, or deliberate misinformation provided by their captors. The medical knowledge that they possessed made them valuable assets to anyone seeking to understand or counter the biological weapons and enhancement technologies that appeared to be central to the evening's events. The rescue operations that became necessary to secure the safety of these hostages tested Batman's ability to coordinate multiple simultaneous actions while maintaining awareness of the broader tactical situation and the potential for these rescue efforts to be incorporated into larger traps, designed to exploit his protective instincts and moral commitments. The decision-making process that governed the allocation of time and resources between immediate rescue operations and long-term strategic objectives required constant evaluation of risks and benefits under conditions where incomplete information made accurate assessment difficult or impossible. The descent toward the facility's morgue represented both a physical journey deeper into the institution's infrastructure and a symbolic progression toward the heart of the psychological darkness that had corrupted the Asylum's therapeutic mission and transformed it into something that served the forces of death rather than healing and recovery. The morgue itself embodied the ultimate failure of medical intervention, the place where hope ended and where the reality of human mortality could not be disguised by euphemism or clinical detachment from the consequences of disease, violence, and despair. The architectural features that characterized the morgue's design reflected the utilitarian requirements of its function, while also incorporating elements that spoke to cultural attitudes toward death and the proper treatment of human remains, creating an environment that was simultaneously clinical and ceremonial in its approach to the boundary between life and its absence. The equipment and facilities that supported the morgue's operations had been designed to handle the routine processing of deceased individuals, while also providing capabilities for forensic investigation and pathological analysis that might be required in cases where death had occurred under suspicious or criminal circumstances. The discovery of Scarecrow's presence within this environment of death and decay represented a convergence of themes that spoke to fundamental questions about the nature of fear and its relationship to mortality. For here was an individual whose entire criminal identity was built around the exploitation of humanity's most primal anxieties in an environment that embodied the ultimate source of existential dread. The psychological impact of encountering this particular enemy in this specific location was calculated to maximize the effectiveness of his signature weapons, while also creating atmospheric conditions that enhanced the power of fear-inducing toxins through their association with death and decomposition. The victims of Scarecrow's experiments that Batman discovered throughout the morgue represented a catalogue of the various ways that human consciousness could be corrupted and destroyed through the systematic application of chemical agents designed to overwhelm the psychological defenses that normally protected sanity from the intrusion of overwhelming terror. The variety of reactions displayed by these victims demonstrated both the sophistication of the toxins being employed and the systematic methodology that characterized their application, suggesting research and development that had continued over extended periods with access to human subjects and laboratory facilities. The transformation of the familiar institutional environment into a nightmare landscape through the application of hallucinogenic compounds represented one of the most insidious forms of psychological warfare that Batman had ever encountered, attacking not merely his physical capabilities or tactical advantages, but the very foundations of his perception and understanding of reality itself. The fear toxin that began to affect his cognitive processes created a form of combat that could not be won through conventional means, but required instead the application of mental discipline and psychological resilience that went far beyond normal training or preparation. The visions that began to manifest as the toxin took effect revealed the deepest sources of Batman's motivation, while also exposing the psychological vulnerabilities that his enemies had identified as potential weaknesses to be exploited in their campaign. To destroy his effectiveness as a crime fighter and symbol of hope for Gotham's citizens. The appearance of his parents' bodies in the morgue represented both hallucinatory manifestation and symbolic truth, for their deaths remained the driving force behind his entire mission and the source of both his greatest strength and his most profound weakness. The nightmare world into which Batman found himself transported through the combined effects of chemical manipulation and psychological trauma represented a distorted version of reality where the normal rules of physics and causality were suspended in favor of dream logic that reflected emotional truth rather than factual accuracy. The landscape of this altered state combined familiar elements from his personal history with surreal distortions that spoke to the subconscious fears and anxieties that shaped his psychological profile, creating an environment where internal conflicts became externalized as physical challenges that could be confronted and overcome through force of will and moral certainty. The massive scale of the threats that manifested within this nightmare realm reflected the psychological magnitude of the fears they represented, transforming abstract anxieties into concrete opponents that could be engaged through the application of familiar tactical approaches, while also demonstrating the power of human consciousness to overcome even the most overwhelming odds through persistence and refusal to surrender to despair. The confrontation with these amplified versions of his deepest concerns provided opportunities for psychological growth and self-understanding that might not have been available through normal experience, though the price of such insights was the temporary abandonment of conventional reality and all the tactical advantages it provided. The bat signal that served as a weapon against the nightmare version of Scarecrow represented both a technological tool and a symbol of hope, combining practical applications with psychological significance in ways that demonstrated the interconnected nature of Batman's technological resources and his role as a symbol of justice and protection for Gotham's citizens. The light itself possessed specific wavelengths and intensities that could disrupt the neural pathways affected by fear toxins, while also serving as a beacon that connected the hero to his larger mission and the community that depended upon his continued effectiveness. The return to normal consciousness that followed the successful navigation of the nightmare realm brought with it both relief at the restoration of familiar reality and increased awareness of the psychological vulnerabilities that had been exposed through the experience, creating knowledge that could be used for future protection, while also providing enemies with intelligence about weaknesses that might be exploited in subsequent encounters. The temporary nature of the victory against fear-based attacks served as a reminder that such weapons could be deployed repeatedly, and that psychological resilience required constant maintenance and reinforcement through continued exposure to the sources of strength and meaning that provided protection against despair and terror. Commissioner Gordon's rescue from what had initially appeared to be death, but was revealed to be another layer of misdirection and psychological manipulation, demonstrated both the sophistication of the conspiracy's planning and the importance of maintaining hope and determination even when circumstances appeared to offer no possibility of positive outcomes. His survival provided crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's objectives, while also restoring a vital ally whose knowledge of legitimate law enforcement procedures and resources could prove essential to developing effective countermeasures against the criminal organization that had transformed the asylum into a battlefield where conventional rules no longer applied. In the depths of Arkham Asylum's most haunted corridors, where the boundary between medical treatment and psychological torture had been systematically erased through years of institutional corruption and deliberate sabotage, Batman found himself confronting an enemy whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of fear and its role in shaping human consciousness and behavior. Dr. Jonathan Crane, known throughout Gotham's criminal underground by the more evocative designation of Scarecrow, represented perhaps the most intellectually sophisticated and psychologically dangerous adversary in the Dark Knight's extensive rogues gallery. For his crimes were not motivated by simple greed, revenge, or even conventional madness, but by a systematic philosophical commitment to demonstrating that courage, heroism, and moral certainty were nothing more than comfortable illusions that could be stripped away through the proper application of chemical agents designed to unlock the primal terrors that lurked within every human mind. The transformation of Dr. Crane from respected psychiatrist and researcher into the terror-inducing Scarecrow had been neither sudden nor accidental, but rather the culmination of years of increasingly unethical experimentation and theoretical work that had gradually eroded the moral boundaries that should have governed his professional conduct and personal behavior. His early career had shown genuine promise, combining exceptional intellectual capabilities with apparent commitment to understanding and treating the anxiety disorders and phobic responses that plagued countless patients who sought relief from psychological conditions that conventional medicine had proven inadequate to address. Effectively, the research that had initially earned Crane recognition within academic psychiatric circles had focused on the neurochemical mechanisms that governed fear responses, seeking to identify the specific pathways and chemical processes that transformed ordinary caution and self-preservation into debilitating terror that prevented individuals from functioning effectively within normal social environments. His theoretical work had suggested that fear served evolutionary purposes that were no longer relevant in modern civilized society, creating maladaptive responses that could be modified or eliminated through targeted intervention in the brain chemistry that produced emotional reactions to perceived threats. The transition from legitimate research into criminal experimentation had occurred gradually, as Crane's growing understanding of fear's biochemical foundations led him to develop increasingly powerful compounds capable of inducing terror responses far exceeding anything that natural selection had programmed into human consciousness. The initial justification for these experiments had been couched in terms of therapeutic necessity, arguing that understanding extreme fear responses was essential to developing effective treatments for patients whose phobias had proven resistant to conventional therapeutic approaches. Yet beneath this veneer of medical respectability lay a darker fascination with fear as a tool for social control and personal empowerment, reflecting psychological pathologies within Crane himself that had been masked by his professional competence and academic achievements. The power that came from being able to reduce confident, capable individuals to gibbering wrecks through the simple administration of chemical compounds provided satisfactions that transcended any legitimate therapeutic goals, revealing the sadistic impulses that had always lurked beneath his scholarly demeanor. The development of his signature fear toxin had required years of refinement and testing, utilizing subjects who were initially laboratory animals, but gradually expanding to include human volunteers who were unaware of the true nature of the experiments being conducted upon them. The compound that emerged from this research represented a masterpiece of biochemical engineering, capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier rapidly and selectively targeting the neural circuits responsible for processing threat assessment and emotional regulation. The psychological effects produced by exposure to Scarecrow's fear toxin extended far beyond simple fright or anxiety to encompass complete reorganization of perceptual processing and rational thinking, creating states of consciousness where the boundary between imagination and reality became permeable enough to allow the victim's deepest fears to manifest as apparently real experiences, indistinguishable from genuine sensory input. The specificity of these hallucinations reflected the toxin's ability to access and manipulate stored memories and emotional associations, creating personalized nightmare scenarios that drew their power from the victim's own psychological history and unconscious anxieties. The costume and persona that Crane adopted for his criminal activities served multiple purposes beyond simple concealment of his identity, functioning as both psychological weapon and symbolic representation of the philosophical principles that guided his transformation from healer to tormentor. The Scarecrow figure had been chosen specifically for its associations with agricultural protection and the ancient human practice of creating artificial representations of threat designed to frighten away creatures whose natural behaviors conflicted with human objectives. Yet Crane's version of this archetype had been inverted to serve as an agent of terror rather than protection. The physical appearance of the Scarecrow costume incorporated elements designed to maximize psychological impact through their exploitation of primal fears and cultural associations with death, decay, and supernatural threat. The burlap mask that concealed Crane's features created an inhuman visage that denied victims the comfort of recognizing their tormentor as fellow human being, while the tattered clothing and rope bindings suggested both the agricultural origins of the Scarecrow concept and the more disturbing implications of execution and violent death that such imagery inevitably evoked. The intellectual framework that Crane used to justify his criminal activities reflected sophisticated understanding of philosophical and psychological theories about the nature of courage and moral behavior, drawing upon diverse sources ranging from ancient Stoic philosophy to modern neuroscience to construct arguments that presented fear as the fundamental reality underlying all human motivation and social organization. In his worldview, concepts like heroism, altruism, and moral duty were nothing more than elaborate self-deceptions that individuals constructed to avoid confronting the basic cowardice that governed their actual decision-making processes. This philosophical commitment to revealing what he believed to be universal human cowardice made Scarecrow's relationship with Batman particularly complex and personally significant, for the Dark Knight represented everything that Crane's theories suggested should be impossible: genuine courage in the face of overwhelming odds, persistent commitment to moral principles despite personal cost, and willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for the protection of others. The existence of such apparently authentic heroism challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Crane had built his entire identity and criminal career. The Asylum's morgue provided the perfect environment for Scarecrow's psychological warfare campaign against Batman, combining atmospheric elements that naturally evoked thoughts of mortality and decay with the clinical sterility that spoke to medical authority and scientific precision. The juxtaposition of death and healing that characterized this space reflected the broader corruption that had transformed Arkham from therapeutic institution into warehouse for society's unwanted and potentially dangerous individuals, creating an environment where normal moral categories had been suspended or inverted. The bodies that Batman discovered throughout the morgue represented a catalogue of Scarecrow's experimental methodology and the systematic approach he had developed for testing different formulations and dosages of his paciziphin, fear-inducing compounds. Each victim displayed unique symptoms and reaction patterns that provided evidence of the ongoing research and development that Crane had conducted using the Asylum's population as unwilling test subjects, demonstrating both his complete disregard for human suffering and his genuine scientific curiosity about the mechanisms that govern terror responses. The preparation that had preceded Batman's arrival in the morgue reflected careful planning and detailed knowledge of the hero's psychological profile, suggesting that Scarecrow had spent considerable time studying his intended victim and identifying the specific fears and traumatic memories that might prove most effective in undermining his mental stability and tactical effectiveness. The environmental modifications that had been made to enhance the toxin's impact demonstrated understanding of both pharmacology and psychology that exceeded what might have been expected from someone whose reputation was based primarily on causing fear rather than conducting legitimate research. The initial exposure to fear toxin that began affecting Batman's perceptual processing created subtle distortions in his awareness of his surroundings that gradually escalated into full hallucinatory experiences indistinguishable from reality, demonstrating both the sophistication of Scarecrow's chemical weapons and the vulnerability of even highly trained minds to properly administered psychoactive compounds. The progression from mild disorientation to complete immersion in nightmare scenarios reflected the careful calibration that Crane had developed through years of experimentation and refinement. The specific manifestations that appeared as the toxin took effect revealed intimate knowledge of Batman's personal history and the traumatic experiences that had shaped his psychological development, suggesting either extensive research into his background or access to confidential information that should have been beyond the reach of ordinary criminals. The appearance of his parents' bodies in the morgue represented both chemical-induced hallucination and psychological truth, for their deaths remained the defining event that had transformed Bruce Wayne from wealthy socialite into dedicated crime fighter. The progression of hallucinations that followed this initial revelation demonstrated Scarecrow's understanding of narrative structure and dramatic pacing, building psychological pressure through a carefully orchestrated sequence of increasingly disturbing images and experiences designed to overwhelm Batman's rational defenses, while also providing opportunities for the fear toxin to penetrate deeper into his consciousness. The theatrical elements that characterized these visions reflected both Crane's background in academic psychology and his appreciation for the dramatic possibilities inherent in psychological manipulation. The transformation of the familiar morgue environment into something alien and threatening illustrated the power of chemical manipulation to alter perception so completely that trusted realities became sources of terror and confusion, creating conditions where Batman's extensive training and experience provided no reliable guidance for responding to threats that operated according to dream logic rather than physical laws. The dissolution of normal cause and effect relationships that characterized this altered state of consciousness represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of Scarecrow's weapons, for they attacked the very foundations of rational thought and tactical planning. The massive scale of the threats that manifested within Batman's fear-induced hallucinations reflected both the psychological magnitude of the anxieties they represented and Scarecrow's understanding of how to transform abstract concerns into concrete opponents that could be engaged through familiar action patterns while maintaining their essential character as manifestations of internal conflict rather than external reality. The gigantic scarecrow that dominated the nightmare landscape served as both literal opponent and symbolic representation of fear itself, combining physical menace with philosophical challenge. The environment that surrounded this central confrontation drew its imagery from multiple sources within Batman's personal mythology, combining elements from his origin story with visual references to the broader Gothic tradition that had always informed Gotham's cultural identity and architectural character. The storm-swept wasteland that served as the battlefield reflected both the internal turbulence that characterized his psychological state and the external chaos that had been unleashed throughout the asylum by the evening's events. The platforms and structures that provided navigation challenges within this nightmare realm operated according to principles that reflected both video game mechanics and dream logic, creating obstacles that tested physical coordination, while also serving symbolic functions related to the psychological journey that Batman was undertaking through confrontation with his deepest fears. The precarious nature of these temporary supports emphasized the instability of perception itself under the influence of fear toxin, while also providing opportunities for heroic action within an environment where conventional rules had been suspended. The pursuit sequences that characterized much of the nightmare experience transformed Batman from hunter into prey, reversing his normal tactical position and forcing him to experience vulnerability and helplessness that his extensive preparation and superior equipment could not prevent or mitigate. This role reversal served both practical functions within Scarecrow's psychological warfare campaign and symbolic purposes related to the universal human experience of confronting forces beyond individual control or understanding. The beam of the bat signal that ultimately provided the means for overcoming the nightmare represented both technological solution and spiritual salvation, combining practical applications of specific light wavelengths, capable of disrupting the neural pathways affected by fear toxin, with symbolic significance as a beacon of hope and connection to the broader mission that gave meaning to Batman's sacrifice and suffering. The signal itself embodied the community support and moral authority that transformed individual vigilantism into legitimate heroism, providing external validation for internal convictions about justice and protection of the innocent. The mechanics of the battle against the gigantic scarecrow required tactics that combined traditional heroic action with understanding of the hallucinatory nature of the threat being confronted, creating a form of combat that was simultaneously real and symbolic, demanding both physical courage and psychological insight to achieve victory over an enemy that existed primarily as manifestation of internal conflict rather than external opposition. The successful navigation of this challenge required acceptance of fear as natural human response, while maintaining commitment to action, despite emotional distress and uncertainty about outcomes. The multiple iterations of this nightmare sequence that occurred throughout Batman's exploration of the asylum demonstrated Scarecrow's systematic approach to psychological destruction, with each encounter building upon the knowledge gained from previous exposures, while also introducing new elements designed to prevent habituation and maintain the toxin's effectiveness despite repeated administration. The variations in setting, imagery, and specific challenges reflected both creative imagination and scientific methodology, combining artistic vision with experimental rigor. The personal significance of these fear-induced visions extended beyond their immediate function as weapons in the current conflict to encompass therapeutic possibilities that neither Batman nor Scarecrow consciously recognized. For the controlled confrontation with suppressed traumatic memories and unconscious anxieties provided opportunities for psychological integration and growth that conventional therapy might not have achieved. The irony that criminal attack might serve healing purposes spoke to the complex relationship between destruction and creation that characterized many of Batman's encounters with his rogues gallery. The gradual development of resistance to Scarecrow's fear toxin that Batman displayed across multiple exposures reflected both natural, adaptive responses to psychoactive compounds and conscious application of mental discipline, techniques designed to maintain rational thought processes under extreme stress, demonstrating the importance of psychological preparation and philosophical commitment in overcoming challenges that could not be defeated through simple application of superior force or advanced technology. The success of these resistance efforts validated core assumptions about the power of will and moral purpose to overcome chemical manipulation and external threat. The revelation of Commissioner Gordon's survival, following what had appeared to be his death, provided crucial intelligence about the broader conspiracy, while also serving thematic functions related to the triumph of hope over despair and the importance of maintaining faith in positive outcomes, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. His rescue from apparent death represented both tactical victory and symbolic affirmation of the values that motivated Batman's mission, demonstrating that persistence and courage could achieve results that rational analysis might have suggested were impossible. The information that Gordon provided about his capture and treatment revealed additional details about the coordination between different members of the criminal conspiracy, while also confirming the systematic nature of the planning that had preceded the evening's events, indicating preparation that extended far beyond simple opportunistic exploitation of institutional weaknesses to encompass comprehensive strategy designed to exploit Batman's psychological vulnerabilities through coordinated assault on multiple fronts simultaneously. The medical knowledge that Gordon had observed during his captivity provided crucial insights into the biological weapons research that appeared to be central to the conspiracy's objectives, revealing the extent to which legitimate scientific research had been perverted into instruments for causing suffering and advancing criminal goals. The combination of advanced chemistry with medieval torture methods that characterized much of what he had witnessed spoke to the intellectual sophistication and moral depravity that defined many of Batman's most dangerous enemies. The psychological impact of the fear toxin experiences on Batman's subsequent decision-making processes reflected both the temporary neurochemical effects of Scarecrow's compounds and the longer-term implications of forced confrontation with suppressed traumatic memories and unconscious anxieties that had shaped his development as both individual and hero. The integration of these psychological insights into his tactical approach demonstrated the potential for criminal attacks to produce unintended beneficial consequences through their revelation of previously hidden strengths and capabilities. The ongoing presence of Scarecrow throughout the facility created persistent threat that required constant vigilance and preparedness for psychological attack, transforming every corridor and chamber into potential battleground where reality itself might be compromised through chemical manipulation of perception and emotional response. The knowledge that any exposure to his weapons could produce complete disorientation and temporary helplessness added layers of tension and uncertainty to navigation decisions, while also providing motivation for developing countermeasures and protective strategies. The therapeutic implications of successful navigation of fear-induced nightmare scenarios suggested possibilities for using controlled exposure to psychological stresses as tools for building resilience and self-understanding, though the ethical problems associated with such approaches made their practical application highly problematic, despite their potential benefits. The transformation of traumatic experience into source of strength represented one of the most fundamental aspects of Batman's character development, reflecting the human capacity for growth through adversity when supported by appropriate philosophical framework and community resources. The symbolic significance of defeating Scarecrow through application of light rather than violence spoke to deeper themes about the relationship between knowledge and ignorance, hope and despair, community and isolation that ran throughout Batman's mythology and provided moral framework for evaluating the choices that defined heroic behavior under extreme circumstances. The bat signal served as reminder that individual heroism derived its meaning and effectiveness from connection to larger purposes and shared values that transcended personal interest and private satisfaction. The emergence from Scarecrow's nightmare realm brought with it the harsh clarity of restored reality, yet the psychological residue of forced confrontation with his deepest fears continued to reverberate through Batman's consciousness as he prepared to face challenges that would test not only his physical capabilities, but his capacity to maintain rational judgment while operating under the accumulated stress and trauma that the evening's events had imposed upon his mental equilibrium. The knowledge that Commissioner Gordon had survived what appeared to be certain death provided both tactical advantage and emotional relief. Yet, the intelligence he had gathered during his captivity revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had transformed Arkham Asylum from therapeutic institution into battlefield, where the forces of order confronted chaos in its most concentrated and malevolent manifestation. The enhancement that had transformed ordinary criminals into superhuman threats through the application of experimental compounds represented perhaps the most dangerous development in the escalating conflict between Batman and the criminal masterminds who sought to destroy everything he represented. For these modifications transcended the normal boundaries of human capability, while also demonstrating the willingness of his enemies to treat human beings as raw materials for weapons research that violated every ethical principle that governed legitimate scientific investigation. The emergence of Bane from what should have been secure containment marked the beginning of a new phase in the evening's conflict, one where brute force would be employed on scales that exceeded anything Batman had previously encountered during his career as Gotham's protector. Bane himself represented the ultimate expression of criminal enhancement through chemical means, his natural physical capabilities amplified through systematic application of the compound known as venom to levels that approached the mythological rather than merely superhuman. Yet beneath this intimidating exterior lay an intelligence that matched his strength and a strategic understanding that made him far more dangerous than enemies who relied solely upon physical intimidation. His presence within Arkham Asylum had been carefully planned rather than accidental, forming part of a larger strategy designed to provide the conspiracy with enforcement capabilities that could neutralize Batman's tactical advantages through overwhelming application of superior force. The history of Bane's development as both individual and weapon stretched back to his childhood in the prison known as Peña Dura, where he had been forced to serve a sentence that should have belonged to his father, creating conditions of constant threat and deprivation that had forged his character in ways that conventional upbringing could never have achieved. The brutal environment of his youth had demanded adaptations that went far beyond normal human development, requiring intelligence, physical conditioning, and psychological resilience that enabled survival in circumstances where weakness meant death and strength was the only currency that could purchase security or respect. The venom that coursed through Bane's enhanced physiology represented the culmination of decades of chemical research and development, beginning with crude experimental compounds that provided temporary strength, increases at the cost of devastating side effects, and evolving through countless iterations into a sophisticated system that could maintain enhanced capabilities, while minimizing the psychological and physical deterioration that had characterized earlier versions of the enhancement process. The delivery system that connected directly to his nervous system allowed for precise control over dosage levels, while also creating dependency that could be exploited by anyone who controlled the supply of the compound. The transformation that had created the current crisis had involved modifications to the basic venom formula that increased its potency, while also altering its psychological effects in ways that made enhanced individuals more susceptible to external control and direction, creating the possibility for armies of superhuman soldiers who could be deployed against targets that conventional criminals would be unable to challenge effectively. The Titan compound that had been developed from this research represented a quantum leap in enhancement technology, promising capabilities that exceeded even Bane's impressive baseline, while also introducing variables that made the results unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. The confrontation that erupted when Bane broke free from his restraints tested the limits of Batman's combat training and tactical preparation, forcing him to engage an opponent whose strength exceeded his own by orders of magnitude, while also maintaining awareness of environmental factors and collateral damage possibilities that could transform their battle into a catastrophe that claimed innocent lives. The boiler room that served as their battlefield had been chosen specifically for its isolation from civilian areas, while also providing structural elements that could be incorporated into combat tactics by fighters who understood how to exploit environmental advantage. The combat system that Batman employed against this overwhelmingly powerful opponent required fundamental modifications to his normal approach, emphasizing mobility and precision over direct confrontation, while seeking opportunities to use Bane's own strength against him through careful application of leverage and timing that could redirect devastating attacks into harmless directions or structural targets that might provide tactical advantages. The Batarang technology that had served him well against ordinary criminals required recalibration and creative application to achieve any effect against an opponent whose enhanced physiology rendered conventional weapons ineffective. The psychological dimension of their battle extended beyond simple physical competition to encompass a clash between different philosophies of strength and power, with Bane representing the belief that might makes right, while Batman embodied the conviction that true strength came from restraint and the willingness to use power in service of others rather than personal advancement. The verbal exchanges that accompanied their physical combat revealed the intellectual sophistication that made Bane far more dangerous than mere muscle, demonstrating analytical capabilities that matched his enhanced strength. The systematic approach that Bane employed in his assault reflected military training and strategic thinking that had been developed through years of commanding criminal organizations and planning operations that required coordination of multiple elements across extended timeframes, skills that made him uniquely qualified to serve as field commander for the conspiracy that had orchestrated the evening's events. His understanding of Batman's methods and psychological profile enabled him to anticipate responses and counter-moves, while also exploiting weaknesses that might not have been apparent to less sophisticated opponents. The destruction of the boiler room's infrastructure that resulted from their battle created cascading failures throughout the facility's utility systems, while also providing the explosive conclusion to their confrontation that neutralized Bane's threat through environmental factors rather than direct defeat, demonstrating the importance of tactical thinking and environmental awareness in situations where conventional combat approaches proved inadequate. The collapse of heavy structural elements that trapped the enhanced criminal reflected both fortunate timing and careful positioning that maximized the effectiveness of available resources. The escape that Batman executed from the collapsing chamber required split-second timing and precise execution of acrobatic maneuvers that pushed his physical capabilities to their absolute limits, while also demonstrating the preparation and conditioning that enabled him to survive encounters with opponents who possessed superior raw power. The journey through shifting debris and unstable structural elements served as metaphor for the broader challenge of maintaining direction and purpose, while operating in an environment where normal rules had been suspended and familiar landmarks had been destroyed. The emergence of Bane, from what should have been fatal entrapment, revealed both the resilience that his enhancement provided and the inadequacy of conventional methods for neutralizing threats that operated beyond normal human parameters, creating tactical challenges that required innovative solutions, and acceptance of the possibility that some enemies might prove impossible to defeat through traditional approaches. The intervention of the Batmobile systems in launching Bane into the surrounding waters demonstrated the importance of technological preparation and remote capabilities in situations where direct confrontation had proven insufficient. The rescue of Commissioner Gordon from immediate danger and his evacuation from the island provided both tactical advantage through the preservation of a valuable ally and symbolic victory that demonstrated the possibility of achieving positive outcomes. Despite the overwhelming odds and systematic preparation that characterized the conspiracy arrayed against them, his survival also provided crucial intelligence about the research activities that had been conducted using the Asylum's facilities while maintaining the pretense of legitimate medical treatment and therapeutic intervention. The journey to the Batcave that Batman had prepared as a fallback position and equipment cache revealed the extent of his contingency planning and his understanding that operations on Arkham Island might require resources and capabilities beyond what could be carried in the field, demonstrating the systematic approach that distinguished his methods from those of ordinary law enforcement agencies or conventional security services. The cave itself represented both practical headquarters and symbolic connection to the larger mission that gave meaning to his individual actions and sacrifices. The intelligence gathered through analysis of Dr. Young's research revealed the systematic perversion of legitimate scientific investigation into instruments for creating weapons of mass destruction and tools for advancing criminal objectives that transcended simple profit motives to encompass ideological goals related to demonstrating the basic futility of conventional morality and social organization. The documentation of Venom research and its evolution into the Titan compound provided crucial insights into the conspiracy's objectives, while also revealing the scientific sophistication that characterized their approach to criminal activity. The discovery that the Asylum's own medical staff had been involved in developing enhancement compounds under the guise of treating psychological conditions exposed the depth of corruption that had infected the institution's mission, while also demonstrating how legitimate authority and institutional credibility could be exploited to pursue objectives that violated every principle that such organizations claim to represent. The betrayal of professional ethics and public trust that this research represented created moral complexities that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. The Batclaw technology that Batman acquired during his preparation for the next phase of operations represented both practical tool for enhanced mobility and symbolic weapon that could be used to reach previously inaccessible areas, while also providing capabilities for manipulating environmental elements in ways that expanded tactical options and strategic possibilities. The mechanical precision required for effective deployment of this equipment demanded practice and skill development that demonstrated the ongoing nature of his preparation for criminal confrontation. The sewer systems that provided covert routes between different areas of the island reflected the comprehensive infrastructure development that had been necessary to support the Asylum's operations, while also creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone with sufficient knowledge of the facility's layout and maintenance requirements. The navigation challenges presented by these underground passages required both physical conditioning and environmental awareness, while also providing opportunities for stealth movement that could preserve tactical advantages through surprise and misdirection. The emergence into Arkham East revealed the full scope of the institutional complex, while also demonstrating how the evening's events had transformed familiar institutional environments into threatening landscapes where normal assumptions about safety and security could not be relied upon to guide decision-making or tactical planning. The architectural features that had been designed to provide comfort and therapeutic benefit now served as potential ambush sites and defensive positions that could be exploited by either side, depending upon tactical circumstances, resource availability. The staff members who remained within the facility, despite the obvious dangers, represented both potential allies whose local knowledge could provide tactical advantages and security risks, whose loyalties and capabilities remained uncertain under conditions where conventional authority structures had been compromised or eliminated entirely. The suicide collars that some wore transformed rescue operations into complex puzzles where conventional approaches might prove counterproductive or even fatal to the individuals they were intended to help. The manor that served as the historical heart of the Asylum complex embodied the institutional memory and cultural traditions that had shaped the facility's development over decades of expansion and modification. Yet its current state reflected the corruption and neglect that had allowed criminal elements to infiltrate and subvert the therapeutic mission that had originally justified its construction and operation. The Gothic architecture that characterized its design created an atmosphere of accumulated history and cultural significance, while also providing practical features that could serve defensive or offensive purposes depending upon tactical requirements. The discovery of Victor Zizas's continued activities within the manor demonstrated both the inadequacy of conventional security measures against enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of the facility's layout and procedures, and the systematic nature of the conspiracy that had coordinated multiple simultaneous operations across the entire island complex. His selection of Dr. Young as hostage reflected strategic thinking that went beyond simple opportunism to encompass understanding of her research value and the psychological impact that her capture would have upon efforts to develop countermeasures against the enhancement compounds. The second encounter with Scarecrow's fear toxin within the manor's corridors created different challenges from the initial exposure, demonstrating both the villain's understanding of psychological warfare principles and his commitment to systematic destruction of Batman's mental stability through repeated application of increasingly sophisticated chemical weapons designed to exploit vulnerabilities that previous exposure had revealed. The childhood regression that characterized this particular nightmare reflected deeper psychological excavation and more targeted assault on the fundamental experiences that had shaped Batman's identity formation. The reliving of his parents' death that the toxin induced represented both the most traumatic experience of Batman's personal history and the foundational event that had provided motivation and direction for his subsequent development as crime fighter and symbol of justice, creating a form of psychological attack that struck at the very roots of his heroic identity, while also providing opportunities for renewed understanding and acceptance of the experiences that had shaped his character. The enforced return to childhood vulnerability served as a reminder of the origins of his protective instincts, while also demonstrating the psychological costs of his chosen mission. The manor's environmental modifications that had been implemented to enhance the effectiveness of fear-inducing compounds reflected both architectural knowledge and understanding of atmospheric science that enabled precise, control over air circulation and chemical distribution, creating conditions where psychological weapons could achieve maximum effectiveness, while also limiting exposure to areas where friendly personnel might be operating. The integration of these systems with existing infrastructure demonstrated planning and preparation that had required months or years of development. The explosive destruction of the safe containing Dr. Young's research notes represented both tactical setback that denied crucial intelligence to Batman's investigation and strategic victory for the conspiracy that eliminated evidence of their criminal activities while also demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice valuable assets to prevent their exposure or capture. The death of Dr. Young herself removed a potential source of information about countermeasures, while also serving as dramatic demonstration of the stakes involved in the evening's conflict. The Warden's rescue from Harley Quinn's custody provided both immediate tactical advantage and intelligence about the conspiracy's command structure, while also revealing the extent to which legitimate institutional authority had been compromised through coercion, manipulation, and direct assault on personnel who possessed access to critical systems and information. His survival ensured continuity of institutional knowledge, while also providing potential testimony about criminal activities that could support future legal proceedings if circumstances permitted their initiation. The cryptographic sequencer that became available during this phase of operations represented advanced technological capabilities that could overcome electronic security measures, while also providing access to communication systems and data networks that might contain crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's objectives and methods. The application of this technology required both technical knowledge and tactical judgment to identify priority targets while avoiding detection or triggering defensive countermeasures that might compromise operational security. The liberation of Poison Ivy from her containment cell marked a significant escalation in the complexity of the tactical situation, introducing an ally whose environmental capabilities could provide crucial advantages while also creating uncertainty about her ultimate loyalties and objectives in circumstances where traditional criminal motivations might be superseded by immediate survival concerns. Her unique abilities represented both opportunity and threat, requiring careful evaluation of risks and benefits, informing tactical partnerships with individuals whose criminal histories created obvious trust issues. The revelation that Harley Quinn had been removed from the Joker's favor following her failure to maintain security over captured assets demonstrated both the internal tensions that characterized the criminal conspiracy and the failure performance standards that governed relationships among its members, creating opportunities for exploitation through psychological manipulation and strategic misdirection that might fragment their coordination and reduce their overall effectiveness. The temporary neutralization of this particular threat provided breathing space for developing countermeasures against other elements of the conspiracy. The journey toward the botanical gardens that served as the location for advanced enhancement research and weapons development represented both geographical progression across the island's landscape and symbolic descent into the heart of the corruption that had transformed legitimate scientific investigation into tools for criminal advancement and personal aggrandizement. The environmental challenges that characterized this approach reflected both natural obstacles and deliberate defensive measures designed to limit access and channel attackers through predetermined routes where ambush opportunities had both natural obstacles been prepared. The botanical gardens that stretched across the eastern quadrant of Arkham Island represented one of the most ambitious and tragically corrupted aspects of the Asylum's original therapeutic vision, where the healing power of nature and the careful cultivation of growing things had been intended to provide solace and restoration to minds damaged by trauma, chemical imbalance, and the accumulated weight of urban existence that had driven so many patients to seek refuge within institutional walls. Yet the transformation that had occurred within these glass-enclosed sanctuaries over the months and years preceding the evening's crisis had perverted this noble intention into something that embodied the very antithesis of natural harmony, creating an environment where the life-giving properties of plant growth had been corrupted into instruments of death and domination that served the twisted ambitions of those who sought to remake the world according to their own diseased visions of perfection and control. The greenhouse structures themselves bore witness to the architectural ambitions of an earlier era, when the integration of advanced engineering with horticultural science had promised to create indoor environments that could sustain tropical ecosystems, regardless of external weather conditions, while providing therapeutic experiences for patients whose mental conditions might be ameliorated through contact with the natural world that urban civilization had increasingly separated from human daily experience. The iron framework that supported vast expanses of glass created cathedral-like spaces where light could pour through transparent walls to nourish exotic plants gathered from every corner of the earth. Yet these same structures now served as prisons where nature itself had been enslaved to serve criminal purposes. The transformation of Dr. Pamela Isley from brilliant botanist and environmental scientist into the eco-terrorist known as Poison Ivy represented perhaps the most tragic example of how noble intentions could be corrupted through exposure to the moral vacuum that characterized Arkham's current administration. For her original commitment to protecting plant life and preserving natural ecosystems had been systematically perverted into misanthropic hatred that viewed humanity as a cancer that needed to be eliminated for the sake of planetary health. Her expertise in biochemistry and plant genetics had been turned toward developing weapons that could kill on massive scales, while her deep emotional connection to growing things had been twisted into pathological identification that denied her own human nature. The serum that had enhanced Ivy's natural capabilities, while also accelerating her psychological deterioration, represented the culmination of research that had begun with legitimate attempts to understand and replicate the chemical compounds that plants used for defense against predators and environmental threats. Yet the application of these discoveries to human physiology had produced changes that went far beyond simple enhancement to encompass fundamental alterations in consciousness and identity that made normal human relationships impossible, while also granting powers that operated according to principles that conventional science could barely comprehend. The relationship between Poison Ivy and the plant life that filled the botanical gardens transcended normal biological boundaries to create forms of communication and cooperation that suggested new evolutionary possibilities, while also demonstrating the potential for consciousness to manifest in ways that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of sentience and individual identity. Her ability to direct and coordinate plant growth through biochemical signals that operated below the threshold of ordinary perception enabled her to transform static gardens into active weapons systems, capable of responding to threats with intelligence and purpose that exceeded anything that natural selection had ever produced. The alliance that had developed between Poison Ivy and the Joker during the planning stages of the evening's conspiracy reflected temporary convergence of interests rather than genuine philosophical compatibility, for her environmental extremism and his commitment to chaos served different ultimate objectives despite their shared opposition to conventional social order and legal authority. The manipulation that had convinced her to participate in schemes that ultimately served his agenda rather than her own demonstrated both his psychological insight and her vulnerability to anyone who could present criminal activities as serving environmental protection goals. The enhancement that Ivy had received through exposure to Titan Compound represented a quantum leap in her already formidable capabilities, transforming her from dangerous individual into force of nature, capable of reshaping entire ecosystems according to her will, while also providing her with the physical durability and regenerative capabilities necessary to survive direct confrontation with opponents who possessed superior technology and training. The fusion of plant and animal characteristics that resulted from this transformation created something unprecedented in evolutionary history, a being that transcended normal taxonomic categories. The takeover of the island's landscape that followed Ivy's enhancement demonstrated the strategic implications of her new capabilities, as root systems and vine networks that had previously been confined to greenhouse environments spread throughout the facility's infrastructure to create a comprehensive surveillance and attack system that could monitor every movement, while also providing the means to eliminate intruders. Through coordinated assaults that combined overwhelming numbers with tactical intelligence that exceeded military standards for battlefield awareness and response coordination. The psychological impact of witnessing familiar environments transformed into hostile alien landscapes tested Batman's ability to maintain tactical focus while operating in conditions where normal assumptions about geography and navigation had been rendered obsolete by the rapid growth of plant life that reconfigured pathways, blocked access routes, and created new defensive positions that could be modified in real time according to changing tactical requirements. The living architecture that emerged from this biological transformation created challenges that no amount of urban planning or architectural analysis could have anticipated. The combat encounters that became necessary as Batman progressed through the transformed botanical gardens required fundamental modifications to his tactical approach, as conventional weapons and strategies proved inadequate against opponents whose biology enabled them to regenerate from damage, while also coordinating their attacks through chemical communication networks that operated faster than electronic systems could match. The integration of plant and animal characteristics in Ivy's enhanced minions created hybrid creatures that combined the persistence of vegetative life with the mobility and intelligence of animal consciousness. The environmental warfare that Ivy employed against intruders reflected both her scientific understanding of ecological relationships and her strategic grasp of psychological pressure techniques, creating conditions where every step forward required constant vigilance against attacks that could emerge from any surface, while also generating atmospheric conditions that hindered visibility, impaired respiratory function, and created sensory confusion that made accurate threat assessment nearly impossible under combat conditions. The greenhouse structures that served as fortified positions within Ivy's domain had been systematically modified to serve both defensive and offensive functions, with ventilation systems that could distribute toxic spores throughout enclosed spaces, while structural elements provided cover for plant-based weapon systems that could coordinate their attacks with precision that rivaled military artillery, despite their biological rather than mechanical nature. The transparent walls that had once provided unobstructed views of botanical collections now served as barriers that contained lethal atmospheres, while also creating psychological pressure through their revelation of threats that could be observed but not directly engaged. The rescue operations that became necessary to extract surviving staff members from areas under Ivy's control required careful coordination between stealth approaches and direct assault tactics, as the plant-based surveillance systems made covert movement extremely difficult, while the integrated nature of the defensive networks meant that any disturbance in one area could trigger coordinated responses throughout the entire facility. The staff members who had survived the initial transformation often bore evidence of exposure to botanical toxins that required immediate medical attention, while also creating uncertainty about their reliability as sources of intelligence or tactical assistance. The discovery of Harley Quinn in a state of temporary incapacitation provided both tactical opportunity and intelligence about the internal dynamics that characterized the criminal conspiracy, revealing tensions and competition among its leadership that might be exploited to fragment their coordination, while also demonstrating the performance standards and disciplinary measures that governed their organizational culture. Her defeat represented a significant reduction in the conspiracy's operational capabilities, while also eliminating one of their most psychologically sophisticated operatives. The line launcher technology that became available during this phase of operations represented a crucial advancement in Batman's mobility capabilities, enabling horizontal movement across areas where traditional navigation had been blocked by plant growth, while also providing tactical advantages through its capacity to establish elevated positions that offered superior fields of observation and engagement. The precision required for effective deployment of this equipment demanded both mechanical understanding and environmental awareness that could identify suitable anchor points while avoiding areas where plant-based defenses might compromise equipment integrity. The negotiations with Poison Ivy that became necessary to secure her cooperation in developing countermeasures against the Titan serum revealed both her retained scientific capabilities and the extent to which her psychological transformation had altered her priorities and decision-making processes, creating communication challenges that required careful balance between logical arguments and emotional appeals, while also maintaining awareness of her capacity for deception and betrayal under conditions where apparent cooperation might serve hidden agendas that conflicted with stated objectives. The botanical expertise that Ivy retained, despite her psychological deterioration, provided crucial insights into the biological mechanisms that governed the enhancement process, while also revealing potential vulnerabilities in the Titan compound that might be exploited to develop neutralizing agents or protective measures that could reduce its effectiveness against unenhanced individuals. Her knowledge of plant biochemistry enabled her to identify natural compounds that could interfere with the synthetic elements of the enhancement, while also suggesting delivery methods that could achieve therapeutic concentrations without causing additional harm to affected subjects. The reluctance that Ivy displayed toward providing assistance reflected both her general misanthropy and specific concerns about enabling activities that might ultimately serve human interests at the expense of environmental protection, creating negotiation challenges that required careful presentation of arguments that framed cooperation as serving planetary health rather than merely human survival. The psychological manipulation required to overcome these objections tested Batman's understanding of environmental philosophy, while also demanding ethical flexibility in presenting information in ways that supported cooperation without constituting outright deception. The threat that Batman employed to secure Ivy's compliance through promises to destroy plant life represented a tactical necessity that created moral complexities regarding the use of environmental destruction as leverage against someone whose criminal activities were motivated by commitment to protecting natural systems. Yet the immediate stakes of preventing mass casualties justified approaches that might otherwise have been ethically problematic under different circumstances. The effectiveness of this pressure demonstrated both Ivy's genuine emotional connection to plant life and the limitations that such attachments created for her operational flexibility. The location of Killer Croc's lair that Ivy revealed as the source of spores necessary for antidote development represented both geographical intelligence and strategic information about the underground infrastructure that connected different areas of the island through natural and artificial tunnel systems that had been modified over decades of institutional expansion and maintenance activities. The accessibility of these areas through botanical networks provided alternative routes that could bypass surface defenses, while also creating opportunities for coordinated attacks from unexpected directions. The enhancement that Ivy received through her exposure to the Titan compound transformed her from dangerous individual into force of nature, capable of terraforming entire regions, according to her biological programming, while also providing to her with defensive capabilities that made direct confrontation extremely hazardous for anyone lacking specialized equipment or supernatural abilities. The growth patterns that emerged from her enhanced physiology reflected both plant characteristics and animal traits, creating hybrid structures that combined the persistence of root systems with the mobility of muscular tissue. The plant-based infrastructure that emerged from Ivy's transformation created a living network that could adapt to changing conditions, while also providing comprehensive surveillance and defensive capabilities that exceeded anything that conventional security systems could achieve through electronic or mechanical means. The integration of sensory organs throughout this biological network enabled real-time monitoring of environmental conditions, while also providing the capacity for coordinated responses that could adapt tactics based on observed enemy behavior and changing tactical requirements. The atmospheric modifications that accompanied the botanical transformation created environmental conditions that favored plant growth, while also generating challenges for air-breathing organisms that required oxygen concentrations and atmospheric compositions different from those that optimized photosynthetic processes, creating natural defensive advantages that could incapacitate intruders without requiring active intervention, while also providing cover for more aggressive biological weapons that could exploit the disorientation and respiratory distress that such conditions produced. The psychological warfare that Ivy employed through her plant-based communications systems enabled her to broadcast intimidating messages, while also gathering intelligence about enemy movements and intentions through surveillance, capabilities that exceeded conventional electronic monitoring in their scope and sensitivity, creating information advantages that could be exploited for tactical planning, while also generating psychological pressure through the constant awareness that observation and potential attack could emerge from any direction at any moment. The cockpit-like structure that Ivy constructed as her primary defensive position represented both technological sophistication and biological innovation, combining mechanical elements with living tissue to create a command center that could coordinate defensive activities, while also providing personal protection through layers of armor that could regenerate from damage while maintaining the flexibility necessary for tactical mobility and weapons deployment. The integration of plant and mechanical systems demonstrated engineering capabilities that transcended normal boundaries between biological and artificial construction. The projectile weapons that emerged from Ivy's enhanced capabilities operated according to principles that combined ballistic trajectories with biological guidance systems, enabling attacks that could track moving targets while also adjusting their chemical payloads based on observed defensive measures and target characteristics, creating weapons that combine the precision of technological systems with the adaptability of living organisms. The variety of effects that these projectiles could produce reflected the sophisticated biochemistry that characterized her enhanced physiology. The minion creatures that served as Ivy's primary attack forces represented successful fusion of plant and animal characteristics, combining the regenerative capabilities and environmental adaptation of vegetative life with the mobility and tactical awareness of animal consciousness to create hybrid warriors that could operate effectively in conditions that would overwhelm purely biological or purely mechanical opponents. Their coordination through chemical communication networks enabled swarm tactics that exceeded the capabilities of individual units, while also providing redundancy that made the overall force resistant to conventional disruption. Technique. The vine attacks that constituted one of Ivy's most dangerous offensive capabilities operated through rapid growth and coordination that could restrain or crush opponents, while also delivering chemical agents that could incapacitate or kill through absorption rather than respiratory exposure, creating weapons that combined physical and biochemical effects in ways that made conventional protective equipment inadequate, while also providing the flexibility to adapt attack methods based on observed defensive measures and target vulnerabilities. The defeat of Poison Ivy through sustained application of explosive weapons represented both tactical victory and environmental tragedy, eliminating a major threat while also destroying botanical collections that represented decades of scientific research and cultivation, creating moral complexities regarding the costs of victory and the responsibility that heroes bore for collateral damage that resulted from their choices of methods and weapons in pursuing objectives that served broader public safety interests while also causing irreversible harm to natural systems. The intelligence that emerged from Ivy's defeat regarding the Joker's ultimate objectives revealed the systematic nature of his planning, while also demonstrating how individual criminal motivations had been coordinated into comprehensive strategy that transcended simple chaos creation to encompass specific goals related to social transformation and the demonstration of philosophical principles regarding the nature of civilization and individual moral responsibility. The party that he had planned as the culmination of the evening's events represented both celebration and final examination of the principles that had motivated his elaborate conspiracy. The invitation that Batman received to attend this climactic gathering reflected both psychological manipulation and genuine challenge, presenting him with the opportunity to confront his greatest enemy under conditions that had been specifically designed to maximize the dramatic and philosophical impact of their encounter, while also creating tactical situations that would test every aspect of his preparation and commitment to the values that defined his heroic mission. The location and timing of this final confrontation had been chosen to provide maximum symbolic significance, while also ensuring that the stakes involved transcended personal rivalry to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of justice and the possibility of meaningful moral action in a universe that often seemed indifferent to human values and aspirations. The descent into the deepest recesses of Arkham Island's subterranean infrastructure marked the beginning of Batman's most harrowing journey yet, a passage through primordial darkness that would test not only his physical courage and tactical expertise, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to confront the most ancient and elemental forms of evil that lurked beneath the innate veneer of civilized society. The sewers and flooded tunnels that stretched beneath the asylum's foundation represented more than mere utility corridors and drainage systems. They were arteries of corruption that had carried the psychological poison of the institution's deterioration into the very bedrock upon which the facility had been constructed, creating an environment where the boundary between literal and metaphorical descent into hell became increasingly difficult to distinguish. The network of passages that connected the island's various facilities through underground routes had been carved from living rock through decades of excavation and expansion. Yet the modifications that had been made to accommodate the needs of increasingly dangerous inmates, had transformed these functional spaces into something approaching mythological underworld, where the normal rules of physics and sanity seem suspended in favor of older and more primitive forms of logic that governed the relationship between predator and prey in environments where civilization's constraints had been stripped away to reveal the savage truths that lurked beneath humanity's carefully constructed moral facades. The water that filled many of these underground chambers carried with it the accumulated runoff from the island's surface activities, creating a toxic soup that reflected decades of chemical experimentation and medical waste disposal that had been conducted with insufficient regard for environmental consequences or long-term contamination effects. The murky liquid that lapped against stone walls and concrete barriers contained traces of every compound that had been developed or tested within the asylum's laboratories, creating an environment where exposure to even small quantities could produce unpredictable physiological and psychological effects that might not manifest until long after the initial contact had occurred. The architecture of this subterranean realm reflected both practical engineering requirements and the psychological impact of prolonged isolation from natural light and atmospheric conditions that supported normal human comfort and mental place. Stability. The arched ceilings and narrow walkways that characterized many passages had been designed to facilitate efficient movement of maintenance, personnel, and utility services, yet their current state of decay and modification created an atmosphere of claustrophobic menace, where every shadow might conceal threats and every sound might herald the approach of something that had adapted to thrive in conditions that would quickly destroy ordinary human beings. The creature that had made these flooded tunnels, his domain, represented perhaps the most tragic example of how scientific ambition and criminal negligence could combine to produce horrors that transcended the normal boundaries between human and monster. For Waylon Jones had begun his existence as merely another victim of genetic accident and social rejection, before systematic abuse and experimental enhancement had transformed him into something that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of species, identity, and evolutionary development. The metamorphosis that had created Killer Croc reflected both natural mutation and artificial acceleration of characteristics that might have remained dormant under different circumstances. The childhood that had shaped Jones into the being known as Killer Croc had been marked by the kind of systematic cruelty and social ostracism that could have driven any individual toward antisocial behavior, yet his physical abnormalities had created additional layers of isolation and resentment that conventional therapeutic intervention had proven inadequate to address effectively. The scaling of his skin and the elongation of his skeletal structure that characterized his natural mutation had been accelerated through exposure to experimental compounds that were designed to enhance human capability, but had instead created something that existed at the intersection of human intelligence and reptilian instinct. The psychological profile that had emerged from years of observation and analysis revealed a consciousness that retained human reasoning ability while operating according to predatory logic that prioritized survival and territorial dominance over the social connections and moral restraints that characterized normal human behavior. The regression toward more primitive behavioral patterns that had accompanied his physical transformation suggested that the enhancement process had activated genetic sequences that had remained dormant since humanity's early evolutionary development, creating a being that embodied characteristics that modern civilization had successfully suppressed through social conditioning and cultural evolution. The underground kingdom that Croc had established within the Asylum's sewer system reflected both his need for environmental conditions that supported his altered physiology and his desire to maintain control over territory that could provide security against the persecution and medical experimentation that had characterized his previous interactions with institutional authority. The modifications that he had made to existing infrastructure demonstrated both intelligence and practical engineering capability that exceeded what might have been expected from someone whose psychological profile suggested regression toward animal behavior patterns. The collection of victims and trophies that decorated Croc's lair served multiple purposes within his psychological economy, providing both practical resources and symbolic validation of his prowess as apex predator, while also creating environmental conditions that reinforced his identity as something that had transcended normal human limitations and moral constraints. The arrangement of these grisly displays reflected artistic sensibility that combined aesthetic consideration with psychological intimidation, creating an environment that served both functional and ceremonial purposes within his solitary existence. The systematic methodology that characterized Croc's hunting activities revealed intelligence and planning capability that transcended simple predatory instinct to encompass strategic thinking about resource acquisition and territorial defense that demonstrated his retention of human cognitive abilities despite his physical and psychological transformation. His selection of prey reflected both opportunistic exploitation of available targets and careful evaluation of risk versus benefit that suggested ongoing assessment of changing conditions and threat levels within his domain. The arrival of Dr. Crane in these subterranean passages represented both culmination of his own psychological journey into ultimate terror and ironic conclusion to his systematic campaign of fear-based psychological warfare. For the academic who had spent years studying and manipulating the neurochemical mechanisms of human terror, found himself confronting the reality of physical predation that operated according to principles far older and more fundamental than the sophisticated compounds and theoretical frameworks that had characterized his criminal methodology. The final encounter between Scarecrow and Killer Croc served as dramatic demonstration of the hierarchy that existed among different forms of evil, revealing that intellectual sophistication and chemical weapons ultimately proved inadequate against the raw physicality and territorial instinct that characterized apex predation in environments where civilized law enforcement could not provide protection or intervention. The consumption of Crane by his reptilian nemesis represented both poetic justice and practical elimination of one threat through the agency of another. The plans that Scarecrow had developed for contaminating Gotham's water supply with fear-inducing compounds represented the ultimate expression of his philosophical commitment to demonstrating universal human cowardice through mass exposure to chemical agents that would strip away the back, psychological defenses and social conditioning that enabled ordinary citizens to function effectively within urban environments. The scope of this terrorist attack exceeded anything that had previously been attempted within Gotham's borders, promising casualties that would number in the hundreds of thousands, while also creating lasting psychological trauma that might prove impossible to overcome through conventional therapeutic intervention. The technical expertise required to implement such a comprehensive assault on municipal infrastructure demonstrated both Scarecrow's scientific capabilities and the extensive resources that had been made available to support the Gend conspiracy's objectives, revealing coordination and funding that transcended the normal capabilities of individual criminals operating without institutional support or governmental backing. The precision timing that would have been necessary to achieve maximum effectiveness suggested advanced planning that had required detailed intelligence about city utility systems and emergency response capabilities. The The spores that Batman needed to collect from Croc's domain represented the final components necessary for developing antidote compounds that could neutralize the Titan enhancement, while also providing protection against the various biological weapons that had been deployed throughout the base evening's conflicts. Yet their location within the most dangerous area of the underground system created tactical challenges that required careful balance between speed and stealth, while operating in an environment where any disturbance might trigger lethal response from a predator who had adapted perfectly to hunt in these specific conditions. The wooden platforms that provided the only safe passage through Croc's territory reflected both the practical requirements of navigation through flooded passages and the psychological pressure of operating under constant threat from an opponent whose sensory capabilities and environmental knowledge provided overwhelming advantages over any intruder who attempted to traverse his domain through conventional means. The structural integrity of these temporary supports created additional uncertainty about their reliability under stress conditions that might develop during combat or rapid movement. The stealth requirements that govern movement through these areas demanded modifications to Batman's normal tactical approach, emphasizing careful weight distribution and vibration control over speed and direct engagement, while also maintaining constant awareness of environmental factors that might alert the resident predator to the presence of potential prey. Within his territory, the acoustic properties of the flooded chambers created conditions where even minor sounds could carry substantial distances while also generating echoes that might mask the approach of threats from unexpected directions. The shock collar that controlled Croc's most aggressive impulses represented both technological solution to the problem of managing dangerous inmates and symbol of the institutional approach that reduced human beings to animals that required electronic control systems to prevent them from acting according to their natural inclinations, creating moral complexities regarding the treatment of individuals whose conditions made them dangerous to others, while also raising questions about the ethical implications of using technological restraints to modify behavior patterns. The periodic attacks that Croc launched against intruders within his territory followed patterns that reflected both predatory instinct and learned behavior based on previous encounters with humans who had attempted to navigate his domain, creating predictable elements that could be anticipated and countered through proper timing and tactical preparation, while also demonstrating intelligence and adaptability that exceeded simple animal responses to territorial violation. The Batarang technology that provided the means for temporarily incapacitating Croc through interference with his shock collar represented both technological solution and ethical compromise, utilizing existing control systems to achieve tactical objectives, while also acknowledging the problematic nature of using devices designed to cause pain and behavioral modification as tools for law enforcement activities. The precision required for successful deployment of this technique demanded both accuracy under pressure and understanding of the electronic systems that govern the collar's operation. The collection process that enabled Batman to gather the necessary spores while avoiding fatal encounters with the territory's primary defender required systematic exploration of partially submerged areas that contained the biological materials essential for antidote development. Yet the environmental conditions that supported spore growth also created ideal hunting conditions for an aquatic predator whose capabilities far exceeded those of any opponent that Batman had previously encountered in direct physical confrontation. The time pressure that governed this collection mission added urgency that increased the risk of mistakes or tactical errors that could prove fatal. In an environment where conventional backup or rescue operations were impossible due to the isolation of the underground system and the specific dangers that characterized Croc's hunting methods, The knowledge that delay might cost lives throughout the facility created psychological pressure that had to be balanced against the survival requirements that demanded careful attention to stealth and environmental awareness. The line launcher technology that provided alternative movement options through areas where traditional platforms were inadequate or unsafe represented crucial advancement in tactical capabilities that enabled horizontal travel across spaces that would otherwise have required direct contact with water surfaces, where Croc held overwhelming advantages through his adaptation to aquatic hunting conditions. The deployment of this equipment required both technical skill and environmental assessment that could identify suitable anchor points while avoiding areas where equipment noise might alert the predator to the intruder's location. The progressive collection of spore samples from different areas of the underground system created cumulative exposure to environmental toxins and biological agents that posed long-term health risks, while also providing the raw materials necessary for developing countermeasures against the enhancement compounds that threatened to transform the crisis from contained institutional emergency into citywide catastrophe that could claim thousands of lives through chemical warfare that exceeded the capabilities of conventional emergency response systems. The final escape sequence that became necessary when Croc's territorial instincts overcame the restraint provided by his electronic collar created conditions of direct pursuit through partially flooded passages where speed became more important than stealth, while environmental obstacles and structural hazards added complexity to navigation decisions that had to be made under extreme time pressure while maintaining awareness of the predator's location and probable attack vectors. The explosive gel that provided the means for sealing off pursuit routes represented both defensive measure and environmental modification that could alter the underground geography to create barriers between predator and prey, while also demonstrating the potential for technological solutions to overcome natural advantages when applied with proper understanding of structural engineering and demolition techniques. The timing required for effective deployment of this defensive measure demanded both tactical judgment and technical precision under combat conditions. The collapse that temporarily incapacitated Killer Croc through structural damage to the tunnel system represented both tactical victory and environmental consequence, eliminating immediate threat while also causing damage to infrastructure that might have long-term implications for the stability of the Asylum's foundation and utility systems, creating moral questions about the acceptable cost of victory when survival required actions that produced collateral damage extending beyond the immediate tactical situation. The ascent from the underground system back to the Asylum's main levels marked both physical return to familiar territory and symbolic emergence from the primordial depths where civilized behavior had been stripped away to reveal the savage truths that lurked beneath humanity's carefully constructed moral frameworks, providing perspective on the evening's conflicts, while also delivering the biological materials necessary for developing solutions to threats that operated on scales far exceeding individual combat encounters. The knowledge gained through successful navigation of Croc's domain provided both practical intelligence about the island's underground infrastructure and psychological insights into the nature of predation and survival that informed understanding of the broader criminal conspiracy, while also demonstrating the importance of preparation and adaptability in confronting opponents whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations through either natural mutation or artificial enhancement processes that created threats requiring innovative tactical approaches and technological solutions. The return from the primordial depths of Killer Croc's subterranean domain brought with it both the precious biological materials necessary for countering the Titan threat and the sobering knowledge that the evening's conflicts had escalated far beyond the scope of institutional containment to encompass challenges that would test every aspect of Batman's preparation, resolve, and commitment to the principles that had guided his transformation from traumatized child into Gotham's greatest protector. The spores that he had gathered at such tremendous personal risk represented more than mere chemical compounds. They embodied hope itself, the possibility that scientific knowledge and moral determination could triumph over the forces of chaos and destruction that had been unleashed through the systematic corruption of legitimate research and therapeutic mission. The Batcave that served as his operational headquarters and laboratory facility had been constructed with precisely such contingencies in mind, incorporating advanced analytical equipment and synthesis capabilities that could transform raw biological materials into refined pharmaceutical compounds capable of neutralizing even the most sophisticated enhancement technologies, while also providing the manufacturing capacity necessary to produce sufficient quantities for widespread distribution should circumstances require mass treatment of affected individuals throughout Gotham's population. The process of developing an effective antidote required both scientific expertise and intuitive understanding of the biochemical mechanisms that govern the interaction between natural compounds and synthetic enhancement agents, demanding careful balance between theoretical knowledge and practical experimentation, while operating under severe time constraints that made exhaustive testing impossible despite the potentially catastrophic consequences of deploying inadequately verified treatments against conditions that might prove resistant to conventional medical intervention. The intelligence that had been gathered throughout the evening's conflicts provided crucial context for understanding the scope and objectives of the conspiracy that had orchestrated these events, revealing patterns of coordination and resource allocation that suggested planning horizons extending far beyond the immediate crisis to encompass long-term transformation of Gotham's social and political structures through systematic demonstration of the inadequacy of conventional law, enforcement, and democratic institutions to maintain order in the face of determined criminal opposition backed by advanced technology and unlimited resources. The water supply that served Gotham's millions of residents represented both the conspiracy's ultimate target and the mechanism through which their psychological warfare campaign could achieve effects that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of individual criminal enterprises. For contamination of municipal water systems with enhancement compounds or fear-inducing agents could produce casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands, while also creating social chaos that would justify the imposition of emergency governmental measures that might prove difficult to reverse once public safety had been restored. The pumping stations that controlled the flow and distribution of water throughout the city's infrastructure had been identified as critical vulnerability points where relatively small teams of saboteurs could achieve disproportionate effects through precise application of chemical agents or biological weapons that would be diluted to sublethal concentrations by the time they reached individual consumers, yet would retain sufficient potency to produce widespread psychological disturbance and social disruption that could destabilize the entire municipal government. The systematic disabling of these facilities that became Batman's immediate tactical objective required both technical knowledge of hydraulic engineering and strategic understanding of the conspiracy's timeline and resource allocation, demanding rapid movement between widely separated locations, while maintaining awareness of the defensive measures that had undoubtedly been implemented to protect these critical assets from interference by law enforcement agencies or vigilante interventions that might compromise the operation's ultimate success. The botanical gardens that had served as Poison Ivy's headquarters and weapons development facility retained their strategic importance even following her defeat, for the plant-based infrastructure that she had established continued to threaten the island's stability, while also providing intelligence about the enhancement technologies that had been employed to create the biological weapons, systems that represented one of the most significant innovations in criminal methodology that Batman had encountered during his entire career as Gotham's protector. The confrontation that awaited him within these transformed greenhouse structures would test not only his combat capabilities against an opponent whose powers had been amplified through Titan enhancement, but also his understanding of the psychological dynamics that governed the relationship between environmental extremism and criminal ambition. For Ivy's transformation from environmental scientist into eco-terrorist reflected broader cultural tensions about humanity's relationship with the natural world that extended far beyond individual pathology to encompass fundamental questions about the compatibility of industrial civilization with planetary ecological health. The cockpit-like structure that Ivy had constructed as her primary command center represented both technological sophistication and biological innovation that challenged conventional boundaries between artificial and natural systems, incorporating mechanical elements with living tissue to create hybrid architecture that could adapt to changing conditions, while also providing comprehensive control over the biological weapons networks that she had established throughout the facility's grounds and buildings. The projectile weapons that emerged from her enhanced physiology operated according to principles that combined ballistic physics with biological guidance systems, creating attacks that could track moving targets, while also delivering chemical payloads specifically calibrated to exploit the physiological vulnerabilities of different species and individual organisms, demonstrating both scientific knowledge and tactical understanding that exceeded what might have been expected from someone whose criminal reputation was based primarily on environmental terrorism rather than military strategy. The minion creatures that served as her primary defensive assets represented successful integration of plant and animal characteristics through enhancement processes that transcended normal evolutionary boundaries to create hybrid organisms that combined the regenerative capabilities of vegetative life with the mobility and intelligence of animal consciousness, producing warriors that could operate effectively in environments that would overwhelm purely biological or purely mechanical opponents, while also providing redundant capabilities that made the overall defensive system resistant to conventionnelle disruption technique. The coordinated attacks that these creatures launched demonstrated communication and tactical coordination that operated through chemical signaling networks faster and more comprehensive than electronic systems could achieve, creating swarm behavior that adapted to changing battlefield conditions, while also maintaining strategic coherence that suggested centralized intelligence and command authority that transcended the capabilities of individual units, operating according to simple, programmed responses. The environmental modifications that had transformed the botanical gardens into a comprehensive fortress reflected both Ivy's scientific understanding of ecological relationships and her strategic grasp of defensive architecture, creating conditions where natural advantages could be maximized while also generating atmospheric and biological hazards that would incapacitate or eliminate intruders, without requiring direct confrontation between defenders and attackers, demonstrating efficiency and tactical sophistication that rivaled military engineering despite its biological rather than mechanical foundation. The explosive weapons that proved necessary for overcoming Ivy's defensive systems represented both technological solution and environmental tragedy, eliminating immediate threats, while also destroying botanical collections that embodied decades of scientific research and cultivation, creating moral complexities about the acceptable costs of victory when survival required actions that produced irreversible damage to natural systems that had intrinsic value beyond their utility as weapons or defensive installations. The defeat that eventually resulted from sustained application of explosive force against Ivy's command structure demonstrated both the effectiveness of technological weapons against biological opponents and the environmental cost of victory achieved through methods that violated the very principles of natural preservation that had originally motivated her transformation from scientist into terrorist, creating tragic irony that reflected the broader moral complexities that characterized conflicts between different visions of planetary stewardship and human responsibility. The intelligence that emerged from Ivy's defeat regarding the Joker's ultimate objectives revealed the systematic nature of his planning, while also demonstrating how individual criminal motivations had been coordinated into comprehensive strategy that transcended simple chaos creation to encompass specific goals related to social transformation through dramatic demonstration of the inadequacy of conventional moral categories and institutional authorities to maintain order when confronted by determined opposition that understood how to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and systemic weaknesses. The party that the Joker had planned as the culmination of the evening's events represented both celebration of his tactical achievements and final examination of the philosophical principles that had motivated his elaborate conspiracy against the forces of order and conventional morality that Batman embodied in his role as Gotham's protector and symbol of hope for citizens who believed that individual heroism could make meaningful difference in confronting the forces of chaos and destruction that threatened civilized society. The invitation that Batman received to attend this climactic gathering reflected psychological manipulation of the highest order, combining direct challenge with implied threat, while also creating conditions where his protective instincts and moral commitments would be tested against scenarios specifically designed to demonstrate the futility of heroic action when confronted by opponents whose understanding of human psychology enabled them to predict and counter every possible response through systematic exploitation of character traits that defined his heroic identity. The location that had been chosen for this final confrontation carried both tactical and symbolic significance, providing environmental advantages that favored the Joker's objectives, while also serving as dramatic stage where the philosophical debate between order and chaos could be conducted through action rather than mere words, creating conditions where abstract principles would be tested against concrete consequences that would determine not only the immediate outcome of their conflict, but also the broader question of whether heroic values could survive. Systematic assault by criminal intelligence that understood how to transform virtue itself into weapon against those who possessed it. The approach routes that led to this ultimate destination had been systematically modified to channel Batman's movement through predetermined passages where additional psychological pressure could be applied through environmental manipulation and strategic positioning of obstacles that would test both his physical capabilities and his mental resilience under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty about what awaited him at his journey's end. The staff members who had been taken hostage during the evening's events represented both immediate victims requiring rescue and strategic assets whose survival or death would serve specific functions within the Joker's comprehensive assault on Batman's psychological equilibrium, creating tactical challenges where conventional rescue protocols might prove counterproductive, while delay could result in casualties that would compromise the moral authority that provided foundation for his entire mission as protector of Gotham's innocent citizens. The enhanced criminals who served as the Joker's primary enforcement assets demonstrated both the effectiveness of Titan enhancement in creating superhuman capabilities and the systematic methodology that had been employed to transform ordinary inmates into weapons, capable of challenging even Batman's exceptional abilities, revealing coordination and resource management that transcended normal criminal organizational capabilities to encompass strategic planning that rivaled military operations in its scope and sophistication. The technological systems that had been deployed throughout the facility to support the conspiracy's objectives reflected access to advanced equipment and specialized knowledge that suggested either external backing from governmental or corporate sources, or the involvement of individuals whose expertise extended far beyond conventional criminal capabilities, indicating that the threats being confronted transcended local law enforcement jurisdiction to encompass national security implications that would require coordination with federal agencies if circumstances permitted such cooperation. The psychological warfare campaign that had been waged against Batman throughout the evening's events represented perhaps the most sophisticated assault on individual mental stability that had ever been attempted by criminal organizations, combining chemical weapons, environmental manipulation, and strategic exploitation of personal trauma to create conditions where even exceptional psychological resilience might prove inadequate to maintain effective decision-making and tactical coherence under the accumulated stress of multiple simultaneous pressures that targeted different aspects of human consciousness and emotional stability. The Commissioner Gordon, who awaited rescue from the final location, represented both personal motivation for Batman's continued efforts and symbol of the legitimate authority that provided moral framework for vigilante activities that might otherwise be indistinguishable from the criminal behavior they sought to oppose, creating stakes that transcended individual survival to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between official law enforcement and unofficial crime-fighting efforts that operated outside normal legal constraints. The serum that threatened to transform Gordon into something monstrous served as ultimate test of Batman's commitment to protecting innocent lives, even when such protection required personal sacrifice that might compromise his ability to achieve broader tactical objectives, creating moral dilemmas where conventional utilitarian calculations proved inadequate to guide decision-making processes that involved competing obligations to individual welfare and collective security that could not be simultaneously satisfied through any single course of action. The injection that Batman received in place of his ally demonstrated both heroic self-sacrifice and strategic calculation, accepting personal risk to preserve someone whose continued effectiveness as liaison between official and unofficial law enforcement efforts provided essential foundation for maintaining civil order through methods that balanced individual initiative with institutional authority. Yet the ineffectiveness of this gesture revealed the futility of conventional heroic responses when confronted by opponents who understood how to transform moral virtue into tactical disadvantage through systematic exploitation of ethical commitments that criminals were free to ignore. The antidote that protected Batman from the enhancement effects represented both scientific triumph and personal vindication, demonstrating that knowledge and preparation could overcome even the most sophisticated chemical weapons when applied with sufficient understanding of biochemical mechanisms and physiological processes. Yet the refusal to accept artificial enhancement also served as philosophical statement about the nature of heroism and the importance of maintaining human limitations, even when supernatural alternatives were available. The final confrontation that emerged from these preparations would test every aspect of Batman's character, capability, and commitment to the values that had shaped his transformation from victim of crime into protector of innocence, creating conditions where the theoretical principles that guided his mission would face practical examination under circumstances specifically designed to reveal their adequacy or inadequacy when confronted by the ultimate expression of criminal intelligence and malevolent creativity that the Joker represented in his role as architect of chaos, an opponent of every form of order that civilized society had constructed to protect its members from the primitive forces that lurked beneath the surface of human consciousness and social organization. The culmination of the evening's nightmarish odyssey arrived with the inexorable finality of approaching dawn, yet the darkness that had consumed Arkham Asylum showed no signs of yielding to the natural progression of time and celestial movement that should have brought relief and restoration to a world that had been tested beyond the normal boundaries of human endurance and moral comprehension. The party that the Joker had orchestrated as the ultimate expression of his philosophical assault on the foundations of civilized society represented more than mere criminal celebration or theatrical display of power. It embodied the complete inversion of every value and principle that Batman had dedicated his life to protecting, transforming concepts of justice, order, and heroic sacrifice into grotesque parodies that served chaos rather than creation, destruction rather than healing, despair rather than hope. The assembly that awaited Batman's arrival had been carefully curated to maximize both psychological impact and symbolic significance, bringing together representatives of every category of criminal pathology and moral corruption that Gotham's unique social environment had produced over decades of urban decay and institutional failure, creating a congregation of evil that transcended individual criminality to encompass collective rejection of the moral frameworks and social contracts that enabled civilized coexistence among beings whose fundamental nature might otherwise drive them toward predatory behavior and mutual destruction. The Titangent enhanced criminals, who served as the Joker's primary audience and enforcement assets, demonstrated both the effectiveness of chemical enhancement in creating superhuman capabilities and the systematic methodology that had been employed to transform ordinary inmates into weapons that could challenge even exceptional opponents through raw physical power, amplified beyond normal biological limitations. Yet, their enhanced strength was coupled with psychological conditioning that made them extensions of their master's will rather than independent agents capable of moral reasoning or ethical choice. The theatrical elements that characterized the gathering reflected the Joker's background in entertainment and his understanding of dramatic principles that could transform simple criminal acts into performances that carried philosophical weight and cultural significance, creating spectacle that combined elements of circus, tragedy, and religious ceremony to produce experiences that transcended ordinary criminal activity to achieve something approaching art, though art dedicated to destruction rather than creation, despair rather than inspiration, chaos rather than harmony. The rooftop setting that had been chosen for this climactic confrontation provided both tactical advantages and symbolic resonance, elevating the conflict above the mundane concerns of earthbound existence, while also creating environmental conditions where the participants would be isolated from external interference and forced to confront each other without the possibility of retreat or evasion that ground-level encounters might have provided, transforming their battle into something approaching mythological confrontation between opposing principles of cosmic significance. The news helicopters that circled the scene, like mechanical vultures seeking carrion, represented both the media attention that the Joker craved and the public witness that would transform their private conflict into spectacle with citywide implications, ensuring that whatever occurred during their final confrontation would be broadcast throughout Gotham and beyond, creating permanent record of either heroic triumph or criminal victory that would influence public perception and social stability for years to come. The monstrous transformation that the Joker underwent through his self-administration of Titan serum represented both ultimate expression of his commitment to chaos and fundamental miscalculation of the psychological dynamics that had always defined his relationship with Batman, for his enhancement eliminated the intellectual parity that had made their previous encounters psychologically satisfying while transforming their conflict from battle of wits into simple contest of physical strength that violated the philosophical framework within which their rivalry had developed meaning and significance. The grotesque mutations that the serum produced in his physiology reflected both the compound's tendency toward unpredictable biological effects and the symbolic appropriateness of external transformation that matched the internal corruption that had always characterized his moral and psychological condition, creating visual representation of evil that transcended mere criminality to achieve something approaching supernatural malevolence that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of human consciousness and moral choice. The challenge that he issued for Batman to undergo similar enhancement represented both tactical necessity and philosophical test, offering equality of physical capability, while also demanding abandonment of the human limitations that the hero had always embraced as fundamental aspects of his identity and moral authority, creating conditions where victory could be achieved only through acceptance of artificial power that might compromise the very principles that made victory meaningful rather than merely successful. The refusal that Batman demonstrated through his injection of antidote rather than enhancement serum served as definitive statement about the nature of heroism and the importance of maintaining human limitations, even when supernatural alternatives were available, choosing vulnerability over invulnerability, weakness over strength, moral consistency over tactical advantage, demonstrating that true power came from character rather than chemistry, from choice rather than capability, from commitment to principle rather than pursuit of victory at any cost. The final battle that erupted between these transformed opponents tested every aspect of Batman's tactical training and strategic preparation, while also serving as physical manifestation of philosophical debate about the relationship between power and responsibility, strength and service, individual capability and collective welfare that had always underlain their psychological conflict, despite its expression through criminal acts and law enforcement responses that obscured deeper questions about human nature and social organization. The aerial combat that characterized much of their confrontation took advantage of the rooftop setting while also demonstrating Batman's superior understanding of three-dimensional tactics and environmental exploitation, utilizing architectural features and atmospheric conditions to overcome disadvantages in raw physical power. Through application of knowledge, skill, and strategic thinking that reflected years of preparation for encounters that exceeded normal criminal confrontation in their scope and complexity, the Joker's enhanced strength and durability required fundamental modifications to Batman's normal combat approach, emphasizing mobility and precision over direct assault, while seeking opportunities to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities that remained. Despite physical transformation, recognizing that consciousness and character could not be altered through chemical means, despite whatever modifications might be achieved in physiological capability and sensory processing. The weapons systems that both combatants employed during their battle reflected the evolution of their conflict from simple criminal apprehension into warfare that transcended normal law enforcement parameters to encompass existential struggle between opposing visions of human potential and social organization with technology and enhanced capability, serving broader philosophical commitments rather than mere tactical advantage or personal aggrandizement. The environmental destruction that resulted from their clash demonstrated the superhuman scale of forces being deployed, while also serving as metaphor for the broader social damage that could result from conflicts between individuals whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations but whose moral development had not evolved to match their enhanced power, creating potential for devastation that extended far beyond immediate participants to encompass innocent bystanders and social institutions. The crowd of enhanced criminals that provided audience and occasional interference represented both tactical complication and symbolic commentary on the nature of leadership and followership in criminal organizations, demonstrating how individual pathology could be amplified through group dynamics and chemical enhancement to create collective threats that exceeded the sum of individual capabilities, while also revealing the ultimate dependence of such organizations on central authority figures whose removal could cause complete systemic collapse. The psychological warfare that continued throughout their physical battle reflected both combatants' understanding that victory would be determined as much by mental resilience and moral certainty as by tactical skill or physical capability, creating conditions where every action carried symbolic weight and philosophical significance that transcended immediate strategic considerations to encompass broader questions about the meaning of heroism and the nature of evil in circumstances where conventional moral categories had been challenged by enhancement technologies and criminal innovations. The gradual exhaustion of the Titan serum's effects that became apparent as their battle progressed revealed both the temporary nature of chemical enhancement and the superiority of natural human capability when supported by proper training, moral purpose, and strategic intelligence over artificial augmentation that provided physical power without corresponding development of wisdom, judgment, or ethical understanding necessary to employ such capabilities responsibly. The final sequence of their confrontation required Batman to coordinate attacks against multiple opponents while maintaining tactical awareness of environmental hazards and collateral damage possibilities, demonstrating command and control capabilities that exceeded individual combat skills to encompass leadership functions that could coordinate complex operations under extreme stress while maintaining commitment to protection of innocent life and minimization of unnecessary destruction. The explosive gel application that provided the decisive moment in their battle combined technological solution with strategic timing that reflected Batman's understanding of both chemistry and psychology, using the Joker's own enhanced strength against him through techniques that transformed physical advantages into tactical vulnerabilities when exploited by opponents who understood how to manipulate environmental factors and techniques, biological processes. The unconsciousness that eventually claimed the Joker represented both temporary victory and recognition of the cyclical nature of their conflict, eliminating immediate threat, while also acknowledging that the philosophical differences that motivated their antagonism could not be resolved through physical conquest alone, but would require ongoing vigilance and continuous commitment to the values that justified heroic action in circumstances where evil persisted despite repeated defeats and institutional containment efforts. The cleanup operations that followed the battle's conclusion involved coordination with legitimate law enforcement agencies and medical personnel who could provide appropriate treatment for enhanced criminals whose physiological conditions required specialized care beyond normal prison medical facilities, creating logistical challenges that reflected the unprecedented nature of the evening's events, while also demonstrating the importance of institutional cooperation in addressing threats that exceeded individual capability regardless of enhancement or training. Commissioner Gordon's recovery from his exposure to enhancement compounds provided both personal relief and professional validation, restoring crucial liaison capabilities between official and unofficial law enforcement efforts, while also confirming the effectiveness of the antidote development that had required such tremendous personal risk and scientific innovation to achieve, demonstrating that knowledge and moral purpose could triumph over chemical weapons when applied with sufficient determination and technical expertise. The arrest and containment of surviving criminals who had participated in the conspiracy required careful evaluation of their individual circumstances and criminal histories, distinguishing between those who had been coerced or chemically influenced and those whose participation reflected genuine moral choice and criminal intent, creating legal and ethical complexities that would require extensive investigation and judicial review to resolve fairly, while also ensuring public safety and institutional security. The evidence collection and analysis that began immediately following the restoration of order provided crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's scope, methods, and resource base, revealing connections and capabilities that extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass support networks and funding sources that might pose continuing threats if not identified and neutralized through appropriate law. Enforcement and intelligence operations coordinated among multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The media coverage that documented the evening's events created both opportunity and challenge for maintaining the delicate balance between public information and operational security that governed Batman's relationship with Gotham's citizens and institutions, requiring careful management of information flow to prevent copycat activities while also providing sufficient transparency to maintain public confidence in the effectiveness of crime-fighting efforts that operated outside normal legal frameworks. The hint of future threats that emerged from the waters surrounding Arkham Island served as a reminder that victory over individual criminals or specific conspiracies could not eliminate the underlying conditions that generated such threats, requiring ongoing vigilance and continuous adaptation to new challenges that would test heroic commitment and institutional resilience in ways that might exceed even the extraordinary demands that the evening's crisis had imposed upon all participants. The transition from crisis response to normal operations that characterized the aftermath of these events demonstrated both the resilience of legitimate institutions and the temporary nature of criminal victory, regardless of its apparent sophistication or comprehensive planning. When confronted by heroic determination, supported by community resources and moral authority that transcended individual capability to encompass collective commitment to justice and protection of innocent life. The legacy of the night's events would influence Gotham's development for years to come, serving as both cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional corruption and inspiring example of heroic effectiveness when individual courage was supported by technological resources and moral purpose that could overcome, apparently, insurmountable odds through persistence, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to principles that transcended personal interest or individual survival. In the profound stillness that settled over Arkham Island, as dawn approached through storm-broken clouds, There existed a moment of cosmic balance, where the forces of creation and destruction paused in their eternal struggle to acknowledge what had been accomplished through heroic action, guided by principles that transcended individual survival or personal victory. The asylum that had witnessed such extraordinary demonstrations of both human corruption and heroic determination stood as testament to the fundamental truth that consciousness, when supported by moral purpose and community resources, possessed the capacity to overcome even the most sophisticated assaults upon the foundations of civilized existence and ethical behavior. The waters that surrounded the facility carried with them both the remnants of defeated evil and the seeds of future challenges. For the cycle of heroism and villainy could never be permanently resolved, but required continuous vigilance and unwavering commitment to values that made existence meaningful rather than merely successful. Yet in the knowledge that such dedication would always be necessary, lay also the assurance that heroes would arise to meet whatever darkness might emerge, guided by the eternal beacon of hope that proclaimed consciousness capable of choosing service over selfishness, creation over destruction, love over fear, tomorrow over yesterday. Sleep peacefully now, guardian of dreams, knowing that even in the deepest darkness there burns an unquenchable light that no shadow can extinguish, no chaos can destroy, no evil can ultimately overcome.